Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, July 18th, and we have a forum plus. I'd like to welcome our guest with us tonight, our governance consultant, Susan Radwan, will be watching the meeting this evening. First on our agenda is to approve the agenda. I do have one change. You'll note at your stations there is an issue brief, and I would like to add that as an emergent item. 8.1, it's in regards to the CEO employment agreement. Are there any changes or additions other than that from anyone? Hearing no discussion on that, if someone would like to make a motion to accept the agenda as amended.
So moved, Rich.
Rich moves, seconded by Jesse. All in favor, raise your hands. And that passed unanimously. Thank you, everybody. Next on the agenda is public comment. Deb, is there anyone available for public comment online? I don't see anyone in the gallery, but I can't see behind me.
Yes. Robert Pulaski, and you are unmuted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, members of the board, staff, members of the public. My name is Robert Pulaski. I'm a longtime transit rider and advocate, and I'm also the vice chair for the Regional Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee. I'll keep my comments short as possible, but I wanted to congratulate TheRide on their $25 million grant that the FDA awarded them just this recently. DDOT has also received a $30 million grant to invest more in sustainable transportation. It's very exciting to see a small little city that has reliable transportation have the opportunity to receive this grant and be able to invest in sustainable projects in the near future. So want to give my biggest congratulations to the entire staff and also the CEO for making this happen and being able to grow Ann Arbor for years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Deb, is there anyone else?
Yes, Jim Mogensen, and wait a second. You are unmuted.
Yes, Jim Mogensen, longtime watcher of things going on at TheRide. So one thing when policy governance was being discussed was the concern about people working on the details of individual projects, and the idea was to send stuff over to staff so that they could sort it through. And as I was looking at the packet this month, I find 90 pages of mostly process. So while there was that initial thought of having it taking board members an hour, almost an hour for more than half of the board members who reviewed the comments related to some of that stuff. And so what I'm saying is just think that it just needs to be a recheck to make sure we haven't shifted over to yet another way of evaluating what's happening. The initial thought was that everybody was in the details about the kind of concrete on the pads at the bus stops. And now I feel sometimes that we've moved in the other direction at a kind of a meta level where people are processing a very high level policy, not policy, but just detailed governance reports. So not always to be grumpy, but just to give you that perspective. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Bye.
Thank you. Deb, is there anyone else?
We don't have anyone else.
Thank you, Deb. We're going to close out public comment and we'll move on to 1.3 general announcements. Are there any general announcements before we get to the big announcement? Seeing none, 1.3.1, the low-no grant success, that would be Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everyone. And I think this is a repetition for many of you, but for our board watchers and for the minutes, I wanted to sort of formally re-announce this announcement. On July 9th, we were honored to receive the acting administrator of the Federal Transit Administration, Veronica Vanderboot, and her FTA colleagues at our garage at 2700 South Industrial, where they announced that we had won our low-no bus grant application. We were awarded $25 million. As we can see on the giant novelty check that many of us have signed in the back, and all of you will be required to sign before you leave this evening. With that money, we are excited to be purchasing 2 hydrogen fuel cell buses, 1 fueling station, and around a dozen hybrid buses. This is our first big win in a competitive grant opportunity, and really a big step for the environmental sustainability goals that you as a board have expressed for this organization. A couple of observations I want to make about this. This really sort of flows from the board's policy directions. First, environmental sustainability was recognized in the ends. More recently, it's been in the executive limitations, but the board has been consistent. And I think you can see the fruits of that effort working towards this big announcement that will make a really meaningful impact in the #1 source of pollution from a transportation agency, which is, of course, our vehicles. So this is the first step towards eliminating eventually maybe 7,000 tons of annual emissions from the bus fleet. I think there's a lot of reasons to be proud of this award. We didn't talk about when Ms. Vanderpool was here. For the low-no grant emissions this year, 2024, there were 477 applicants from around the country. Of those 477, only 117 got chosen. So maybe 25%. Of those 117, we received the 18th highest dollar amount award. We have definitely punched above our weight. We are up there. I was looking at all of them. MARTA, the Atlanta system, was right next to us. So we were way over performing in that respect. And that was our first attempt. I tried to manage everyone's expectations earlier this year. You may remember when I said, well, we might not get it the first time. So now we're all terrified that we've set your expectation really high, but we're gonna work on it. So really, I think with this, we're kind of at the end of the beginning of this process. We're going to continue to pursue more funds for this and other projects, but the staff is starting to pivot towards next steps and implementation. And I want to say just a few words about that because you might be curious. So staff, up to now, this has been a hypothetical project. With all the work we've done, it's very much been a desk exercise. Going forward, the project has to pivot into an implementation project. So we're going to be reorganizing ourselves more from an execution point of view, and you'll start to see that in how we discuss and present information. We're also working to lock down these funds. This $25 million is part of an executive branch award. And in any presidential election year, there is a chance for transitionary changes of priorities. So the thing we're working towards over the next 5-6 months is what the feds call obligation. We need to get the money obligated. That is sort of a very firm commitment, like a legalistic commitment from the federal government that they will provide this money. The giant novelty check is nice, but it's the obligation that we really need. So we're going to be working to get that in, simply because in a presidential election year, you never know exactly what would happen. We're also going to continue to pursue an earmark opportunity that's related to this. Senator Gary Peters has been very helpful to this agency in the past and is continuing to show interest in this project in particular. His team vetted and advanced through the first step, the hydrogen fueling hub part of this project. So that's $3.4 million, which is also here in this grant. If he does get that earmark for us, we may be able to talk to the FTA and ask them to pivot the 3.4 in the low-no grant into more hybrid buses. That will simply allow us to execute faster and larger, reducing more emissions soon. So we're going to keep that one going as well. Once the funds are committed and secured and we know what the final dollar amount is, we're going to be updating all our financial plans. We'll come back to you with more specifics about exactly, is it about a dozen buses or is it exactly a dozen buses? We'll have all of that. We are also going to begin to move forward with procurements We streamlined that in our application, so we've already selected the vendors. We don't have to go through a competitive bidding process, so that cuts about 6 months off the whole timeline right there, which is nice. However, the timelines are still very long. I need to be honest with you. At this point, since there are only 2 bus manufacturers left, we're looking at timelines of 2 to 3 years for delivery, which is an all-time not great situation. We, as all of the agencies who won these awards, begin to move towards those same 2 manufacturers to get their orders on the books, we want to try to be as close to the front of the line as we can. But all of that can only be accomplished once we have the obligation in hand or near it. Nevertheless, we're still on time for our initial timeline that we presented to you, I think back in October and November and December, about having buses in service late 27, early 28, so that we can run a pilot in all seasons and make a more firm decision about the future of the fleet in 2029. So just want to make sure everyone's still on track with that. So finally, as I begin to wrap this up, we want to reiterate our thank yous to the Biden-Harris administration and the Federal Transit Administration. They have displayed great wisdom in selecting us for this project, and we thank them. Really want to thank the staff, the entire Fleet Services Department, Troy, Jimmy, all the technicians and mechanics. They went to many more agencies on field trips than I realized. I'm sure that's in the travel budget somewhere, but I'm sure it's money well spent because it helped us, make a good decision. The facilities department, putting up with my questions about whether or not they really need that wall over there or can I drive the pipe through it. That was helpful. The finance group, Dina and Crystal, did a great job getting the grant in, paperwork. Jeff and Sam and the Public Affairs and Community Engagement Department did a great job organizing our event the other week. We certainly did impress a lot of people. Staff who prepped that building worked very hard over a holiday weekend. We owe them our thanks as well. Of course, TWU Local 171, we appreciate their support going into this. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, Senator Gary Peters, and others who wrote letters of support. We thank many of them, probably more than I can name in one evening. So one last thank you, and that's to you, the board. Your support through that process, starting with giving us your expectations alone, allowing staff to go off and do all the technical professional judgment stuff that staff needed to do, accepting a CEO recommendation in October, giving us really good questions through December that I think made the project much better, accepting a proposal in January, which you did, and letting us get that paperwork in. Your trust in the process and in staff is very much appreciated, and you can see with 6 zeros over there what it leads to. So that's, I think, excellent. It worked. So in closing, we got a lot of work behind us and probably even more ahead of us, but we should be proud of it. I think all of us. It was a big team effort and a lot of pats on the back. We're going to ask everyone who hasn't already, please sign the big novelty check in the back. We're going to mount that on the wall back at the office. So thank you, Madam Chair. That concludes my comment.
I have a round of applause. On behalf of the board, I would just like to say how very proud we are of our staff, of our CDO, and everyone who took part in this process. It has been a whirlwind, certainly unexpected, but it places so much, I don't know, how do I want to say, the care and the mindfulness that everyone took to make this happen was just amazing. And I just want to open it up real quick to the board. Would anyone like to say anything before we move on? Seeing nothing, we will go ahead and move on. Thank you again. It's the consent agenda. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented in your packets? So moved by Mike, seconded by Sydney. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing no discussion, we will go ahead and vote. All those in favor of accepting the consent agenda, please raise your hands. And that passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody. Next on our agenda is ownership linkage, 3.1 ownership dialogue or open dialogue task force updates, and that's Mr. Rich Chang.
Yep, just a very quick update. Matt and I were hoping to this week, but we had to postpone it, so we are meeting August 9th to talk about the steps for to wish regards to the membership. So done.
So, does anybody have any questions for Rich? Seeing none, we'll move on to the governance process policies under monitoring. In your packet on page 20 begins the worksheet results of the governance process policies. I have to say the governance committee reviewed them and we have met and discussed them. I want to open it up to the board and see if anyone has any comments or concerns about the report itself. The board very much rated itself, I think, quite high. I think everybody seems to be doing well with the processes. There was one area of concern, but I'd like to hear from other board members before I speak. There are no comments. I just wanted to point out that under 3.1, the governing style that we're working on, while we had 5 people said that we were doing well, 2 people said that we needed to concentrate on some areas, especially B, D, G, E, and F, H. And I would just like to bring that to everyone's attention, maybe reread those areas, think about what you might be doing to contribute to it going well, or maybe not so well, and adjust your behavior on those things. But I think overall, the board is proving to be quite successful in the work that it's been doing. So thank you, everyone. And there is no need for a vote because it's our policy, not a monitoring from Mr. Berger. Next is, oh, do you have something, Jesse? Okay. Of course.
I guess I have a question for the board. This was the first time I think we would change the question, the way that we asked the question, and I wanted to get a sense. And by the nature of how we phrase the question, there's going to be more clarity. You're provided with 3 options. But how did board members feel about that? That was something we had a lot of discussion on our governance committee about to try and help provide clarity as opposed to say this is switching from the some of the time, most of the time, all of the time responses. Did people feel like this was helpful, and did it allow you an opportunity to express a breadth of opinion, or was it overly limiting since we did limit the choices? Y'all notice that. That's great.
If there is no dialogue on that, then I will assume that we're heading on the right track. That the yes and no questions were much more made the report easier to run out. Yeah. Very good. Then we're on the right track. Thank you so much. Thank you for asking that question, Justin. Then we're going to go ahead and move on to the update 4.2, the CEO approach to reports. That's Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to be brief on this process update. So over the last couple of years, as we've gone back and forth about monitoring reports, a couple of challenges, annoyances maybe have come and gone. You've also noticed some opportunities perhaps for improvement. And speaking with Susan Radwan, not long after she was hired to assist the board, she gave us some additional thoughts on how we could write monitoring reports and opened a couple of windows we didn't know existed for us. And so we've started to incorporate some of those ideas into the monitoring report, and you'll see some of them in the environmental sustainability report, which is coming up after this. Just want to touch on them very quickly because I think it might make for more satisfying engagement from the board, with the board. First of all, we've often had sort of big outcomes. For example, all bus stops will be wheelchair accessible, but that may take a decade. We now realize we can, within that broader context, set interim targets. And those interim targets are better suited for the monitoring period. So rather than are you in compliance with something 10 years away, we can say this next period, we're going to do 10 bus stops. Did we hit that? Yes or no? So we're making progress. And this, I think, I remember Rich, back in the ends report last winter, made a comment about wanting us to be able to set ambitious targets. And he'd rather we miss a high goal than set the bar low and always clear it. By using these interim targets, I think we can kind of make progress in that direction. You're going to begin to see that in tonight's monitoring report. The second change is we didn't realize we could provide an explanation for any sort of underperformance or something that didn't go right, say a pandemic occurred. So Susan said, yeah, you can do that, and that's the board can judge your explanation. So we will start providing a little brief bit of explanation. If we didn't hit a target, we'll say a very short bit about why, and you can judge the validity of that as well. Finally, monitoring reports and the board's focus through policy governance should be on the outcomes that your policies have been focused on. So we've tried to purge the monitoring reports of any reference to the activities, the hows are we going to achieve these goals, because it tends to lead us into conversations about those activities. But we realize we can cross-reference the monitoring reports to the business work plan, the work plan and business plan, I should say, the Gantt chart that we'll be talking about a little bit later today. So that gives us a way to sort of table a conversation about the hows, for example, on environmental sustainability, and bring it up in a more appropriate setting, rather than having it bog down the monitoring report process. So with that, we did talk about this, I think, with both committees. And at the finance committee, we got a good question about what's the board supposed to do with interim targets and explanations? How should you judge them in your survey? Do we need to change the surveys for the monitoring report? And Rosa and I have discussed it. We don't believe you do. In attachment 2 here on page 39, we try to give you a little bit of guidance here. When we set interim targets, you should think of that as just part of the interpretation and judge the interpretation as you would before. Does it have a measure? Does it have an appropriate degree of compliance? You can apply, previously you might have been applying that to the long-term goal. Now, like all bus stops wheelchair accessible by 2033. Now you're going to look at that, and in the next year we'll do 10. Or this last year we should have done 10. So you can gauge both of them with the same yardstick, if you will. The explanation, especially if we underperformed, if I come back and say we only got 8 of them done. Now I can provide a little bit of background about why. I can say there was a nationwide cement shortage or something. And you guys can decide if that piece of evidence is satisfying, just as you have every other piece of evidence. Admittedly, it's a little bit different as an explanation, but it basically comes down to, do you buy it or not? Is it an explanation or an excuse? And we've given you some examples here about how you might turn those into the motions that you use in judging it. And you can simply say, as you might, everything's okay, except this interpretation we don't find reasonable. And specifically, it's this timeline on this interim step. We like the big picture, but this short-term timeline, we need to do better. Similarly, if you don't, you like the interpretation, but you don't like the explanation, you can say the evidence is lacking for this reason. So I hope that gives a little more thought about how you as board members can gauge these changes, the new interim targets, and the possible uses of explanations from time to time.
Does anyone have any questions? I know. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, but thank you very much. We discussed in the finance committee meeting the couple of things that you just mentioned, which are now reflected on page 39. I appreciate that a lot. But I still fuzzy, particularly about the explanations of how that ties into evidence. And this brings up an issue that really I don't think has been discussed before. It just struck me again when I went through this regarding your examples here. And that is, when the board looks at the monitoring reports, it looks at the interpretation and makes a determination on whether they're reasonable. And there's some guidelines, I think there's board guidelines about interpretation being reasonable. And if you answer those questions, yes, then we should supposed to say they're reasonable. If they're measure standard, defensible rationale for the measure standards, level of achievement necessary to achieve compliance in the rationale for the level of achievement. When we vote at the end, basically, I think it's all consistent with how we filled out our evaluation while we look at the monitoring report. On the other hand, evidence, to me, there's a disconnect that hasn't been discussed before. Because when we write in our evaluation of your monitoring report regarding evidence, the question is it verifiable? And then when we get to voting, we talk about is there compliance with the interpretation? And so there's a disconnect that we really haven't talked before, that I recall. And so and putting in another thing in here, and you're having some nice examples, to me makes that even muddier when we're talking about explanations of non-compliance, because how does that link into verifiable? And shouldn't we be answering some kind of, while we're filling out the forms, something having to do with compliance in addition to or instead of verifiable?
If I might match, Susan has her hand raised. Would you like to answer first and then hear from Susan? Or
Oh, we've got to let Susan go.
hello, Susan.
Hello, everybody. A couple of thoughts. First, in response to Mike's comments. So the evidence that is shown, it relates to the metrics that have been defined for performance for that reporting period. So the interpretation includes a projection of performance based on the metrics, a data track, and what is it that we should be achieving on the data track. So if it's, fixing, wheelchair accessible, 10 wheelchair accessible bus stops, that is a metric. And so the evidence, how are we going to prove that we actually did that? That's where the evidence, needs to come in, and that needs to be verifiable. So if it's taking pictures of all 10 or something like that, where you as board can actually see real evidence that has been achieved, is where that verifiability should come in. So as it relates to, when the staff falls short of achieving a projection in that interim, for that interim period, and they provide you an explanation. The other thing that should also be incorporated into that, besides just the explanation, is a rehab plan. How are we going to manage and get to our goal? Is that even possible at this point, or do we need to rethink our goal because of this national shortage of whatever the condition is? So if it is a controllable issue that, if we just work harder or smarter, at what point will we actually hit 10 wheelchair accessible things if we fall short? And so then you as board might then want a special report acknowledging that has been now achieved, that the rehab plan has gone into play, and we are now on track. The other thing to always remember is that from year to year, as you are monitoring, is that the interpretations can change. So, you know, we're starting out with a long-term plan that we think is reasonable, and you know, as board say, yep, that seems like a reasonable plan, and for this 1 year period, reporting period, you know, that's a reasonable interpretation. But if there are barriers to actually the achievement of those things, you know, Matt has the ability to reinterpret. So the long-term interpretations are not set in stone, particularly, you know, and if they do change, that should be noted that there's a change in interpretation, you know, at the front end of any report that you get, so that you are aware that, you know, there is a change. I believe that, you know, when an interpretation changes, you should be made aware of it as part of a communication and support to the board. So, you know, timing of that notification is an issue for discussion. But those are some things around, you know, if the operational organization falls short of a projection that's inherent in their interpretation, there should also be a rehab plan to go along with that. And if there isn't, then the board should be requesting one by a certain date.
Could I respond to Sue? Of course. So I think I probably did make my point clear. I'm not talking about interpretation. I'm talking about notice. We fill out the forms talking about whether the evidence is verifiable. When we get into the voting, we don't talk about, we do talk about on the interpretation side, whether it's reasonable. So that's consistent. But on the evidence side, instead of, we said whether the evidence is verifiable, now we're back to saying the evidence, actually read the words. The demonstration compliance with the interpretation. Reasonable interpretation of all policy actions. The evidence demonstrates compliance. The evidence demonstrating compliance puts the link of that to filling out the form when we were talking about evidence being verified.
Yeah, so in that explanation, Mike, the report ought to, first of all, define, you know, compliance will be shown when, and, you know, and whatever, you know, and the when is, you know, what is the state of the final productivity, and, you know, and that piece also should identify how that data is pulled up, which is the verifiability of that metric. So, you know, they're in that justification or the rationale for, you know, the compliance will be shown when, there should be a statement in there as to how that data is going to be pulled, or how that data is going to be created, rather than a statement like, you know, it's going to be reasonable because I'm a reasonable person, and of course anything I do is reasonable. So, you know, there has to be, that evidence needs to be there, and there should be a statement in the monitoring report that indicates how that data was created.
You kind of defined compliance to the data. Nowhere have I ever seen in writing how you make a judgment on compliance regarding.
A lot of it has to do with you know, the justification of why the board should see this metric as reasonable. You know, on what basis would the board judge that? And if that explanation makes sense, that common sense, that's where the board then can say, yes, this falls into the case of a reasonable interpretation. The evidence is part, or the how the data is pulled is part of the interpretation. It's not separate, it's part of. And the rationale shared around that for why the board should see that as meaningful and significant data is, part of the interpretation as well.
Matt wanted to say something.
Yeah, I might try to say similar things in a different way. So for every piece of evidence that I provide you, I'm supposed to provide some degree of proof in that evidence, whether it's photos of it or a third-party certification. Sometimes I use the FTA, their triennial review, for example. The audit, we use the audit as evidence of financial compliance. Again, third party. So we're always trying to link to some sort of something that you guys would be satisfied with that proves that the evidence is accurate. We have that challenge with every piece of evidence. Now that we're introducing explanations, the way I'm thinking of it, and it might be a little overly simplistic, the explanation is like another piece of evidence that needs to be proved. So I've just given you another claim, just like the claim. We're going to do 10. She says projection. I say target. We're going to do 10 in the monitoring period. I could give you 10 photos, or I could give you 8 photos and an explanation of why we didn't get the last 2. How do you know that my explanation is there any evidence for that explanation? If I were to claim, we didn't get to all the bus stops because of the nationwide concrete shortage, and none of you were aware that there was a concrete shortage, you might reasonably ask me, what concrete shortage? Give me some proof that there's a concrete shortage. So you're trying to discern whether the explanation is a genuine explanation or an excuse. So and again, it all comes back to what is satisfying to you as a body. If I can provide something behind that explanation that you look at and go, yeah, it sounds true to me. That seems reasonable. I can accept that as a body. That might be good enough. If it's something much more important than, say, 2 bus stops, you might, and I didn't hit the target, you might reasonably want a little more clarity behind the explanation. I might need to provide a little more proof about it, but I see the explanation as just another piece of evidence that has to have something behind it. I don't know if that makes any more sense or if it makes it any worse, but that's kind of how I think.
Yeah. And really, to me, this is an issue before we get into the discussion of explanations. And maybe I'm the only one who feels it. But I think it would be really good if while we are filling out our reports, if we think, even though the evidence is verifiable, we do think it's compliant, and maybe we don't have any way of reflecting that except when we get to the board meeting. There just seems to be a disconnect. I think it would be helpful to have something that would actually connect what we're putting down on a piece of paper with what we can express in action. Maybe I'm the only one who has a problem with that. I can look.
Jesse has a response.
Yeah, I think so. My interpretation of the way I'm understanding what's being said is that that compliance is part of the interpretation, and so the compliance is in the interpretation, the level of part of the interpretation is compliance will be determined when this standard of evidence is met. And so we are measuring compliance when we are deeming the interpretation to be reasonable. And then the evidence, and then if the evidence provided supports that, then say, okay, then the evidence is in support of this reasonable interpretation of the policy.
Yeah, this is kind of a conundrum similar to what's reasonable or not. Is it? What is compliance and how do you define it and how do you reflect it? I'm just thinking it would be better if we had some kind of a link and we actually talked about and defined compliance. That's
So we got form. Is the modification request part of our evaluation form or part of the information before we? Like I'm hearing it more of we'd like a modification to that evaluation form.
I think that would make sense. So that it could more directly tie into what we're about. And maybe I'm the only one who feels that. But I said, that's okay.
I'm okay with the idea that see that staff can propose what compliance is on a policy by policy basis as part of their interpretation. And then we're free to, and then it's up to us to determine whether or not we agree. But so in terms of how is compliance defined, I'm understanding it that compliance is or rather a definition of compliance is proposed by staff and then judged by us.
You know, if I might, since I'm the one who's guilty of introducing this whole conundrum, I would be happy to work with any members of the board to try to clarify how that should be, that should lead to any changes in the survey form, if we could improve those questions somehow, or the resolutions that you're given as models. I'd be happy to work offline to sort of do that. I do think the introduction of explanations can be a very useful thing.
I agree.
It pops the hood a little bit more for you guys without opening the whole door to all operational needs. It provides a little bit of backstop. And frankly, it also gives me the confidence to aim high and miss, which is back to what I think Rich was asking for on the ends. If I had an opportunity to explain why we didn't quite hit the target, I think that gives us an option, makes us more confident in shooting higher. But since I started the confusion, I'm happy to work with board members to sort of figure it out.
Yes, Susan has her hand raised.
Yeah, I have two comments. First one is that when, Jesse is correct that when you get that interpretation, you evaluate it, and it's not whether you agree with it. There's a nuance in that. It is that, does that interpretation meet the test of any reasonable interpretation? So that's a little broader than whether you agree with it, because it's not about, is it my interpretation? It's, does it meet the test of any reasonable interpretation? And the second point is that the rationale or the justification, whatever word you want to use in that, should be formatted in a way, or not formatted, but should be presented in a way. The intent is to convince you, to persuade you why you should see this, this choice as meeting the test of any reasonable interpretation. So as Matt said, if, the comparative value comes from an authority like, the Federal Transportation Authority, that is an objective baseline or benchmark or whatever that is, that can help, you to determine whether or not this really is reasonable. Or does it meet the test of that any reasonableness? So the rationale is all intended to frame things so that you can see the thinking behind the choices made that will help you determine whether it meets the test of any reasonable interpretation.
Any other discussion on this item? Just what you
I wasn't sure if it determined when do you, when will the board be informed of the targets, be them interim or in like, are we going to be a situation where we don't know the target until it's up for monitoring and staff would have an opportunity to retroactively set the targets at whatever they met at that time? So when will we receive the target?
So that's a good, let me write that down. In all honesty, that might be a good segue into the monitoring report, a couple of pages ahead of you, because you're going to see in there is the way we're using the interim targets in the environmental sustainability context is we're saying, you know, for example, in one policy, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2045. And carbon emissions at that point will be 0. But then we kind of chunk it up into 5-year pieces. And our intent is to populate all of those 5-year interim targets next year so that each monitoring period, you can kind of look, okay, we're making progress on that. So the idea here is once we sort of make sure the structure works, that you would have the target in advance, and it wouldn't be retroactively moving the goalpost to wherever I manage to pump the ball.
So as we start, if we were to transition to this, or as we start transitioning to this, there's going to be a first time we monitor these policies with this, and we won't have received we won't have known the target that was previous. But do you have a plan for how you might interpolate what the target was? Like, so using the bus stop, saying we, like in the budget, there's evidence there that said this was what we budgeted for. We've always planned to bring 10 stops up to date. I don't know if it's going to be as easy for all of the other policies to do something like that.
It's a good question. It won't be. We've already sort of gone through the asset protection monitoring report is almost ready, but I didn't want to give it to you, so we're done with this meeting. If you had enough, it's a big packet. That one deals with mostly long-term things, so interim targets are less useful in that regard than they are with environmental sustainability. When it's a policy where it's kind of a binary yes, no, an interim target is not as much help. When it's an audacious long-term goal, like in bus stops, I think are under treatment of the traveling public. Come on, Jesse, you and I are arguing over this.
Yeah.
Okay, it's in one of that. I think it's in that. That's a good example of where, you know, when that one comes around, we will modify it to say, because what it said previously is we will have all bus stops wheelchair accessible by 2033. I think 10 years from last year. And we realized at that point that we were going to be reporting non-compliance for the next 10 years. This is just a big goal. It's going to take a long time to get there. And frankly, it was a little demoralizing for everybody. I think if we just had to keep coloring that red, even though we've made good progress each year, that just felt like we're kind of, you know, masochistic almost. So what we're going to do in there is introduce those interim targets. We're going to keep, you know, the 2033 goal for all of them, but we'll start to break it down. It may look like 10 per year. Just going to pick that one out of the air as an example. You will then have, and you know, I'll lay that out, and you'll see that before the monitoring period. And we may have 1 year of sort of transition where the interim target is a new thing. That may be unavoidable. But if we populate the whole table until we reach the big audacious goal, then that's written down. All the monitoring reports are on the website. You guys can go back and fact check whatever I said 3 years ago, and you can do that anytime. That's quite on purpose. And when we write these things, we know you can do that. So it's getting caught moving the goalpost is bad. So we just don't do that. Right. I'd rather cop to something.
My question was really, I think probably most pertinent to this next year, or like the first monitoring period for the next, you know, for each report, since we won't have established, we won't have that record to go to yet. So I think I was just anticipating that it might be a little bit difficult to judge compliance without that, for just again that first time around without having that baseline or without having those goals set from the previous monitoring period.
Is it okay for Susan?
By all means.
Susan, go ahead.
Jesse, in direct response to your question about how you would know if the policy gets changed, the projections get changed, you do have a policy number 2.9.1.5 under communication and support to the board that says it's not okay for the CEO to let the board be unaware of material internal changes, including changes in policy interpretation. So you have that addressed, that notification. And, as evidence of that, with the environmental sustainability, the new approach that Matt's been taking, that communication with you is in compliance with this, because it is a change in interpretation, it's a change in approach, it's all that kind of stuff. One of the things that I think is, a danger in policy governance is that when the CEO is not communicating a change in policy, in interpretation, and then you're surprised after a full year of activity and nothing's happened, because the CEO may have changed the interpretation to minimize potential progress. That's not a good thing. And so to have that, the change of interpretation consider it to be a material change internally is, I think, a healthy thing, and assures that the board would get that kind of heads up if the interpretation is going to be modified for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I'm not actually concerned about this as a long-term. This is what I think, in my mind, more of a practical consideration of the transition period as we take on this new approach of, so I'm not too concerned about this as a model in the long term. It's really just we have to do this it's the first time that I'm questioning what's the practicality of the transition.
If I might, I do have an example of how we're trying to do this
Sure.
right now. And if we might turn to page 44 in your packet, and this is kind of sliding into the next agenda item. So we can always back up if we need to. You'll see on page 44, this is part of the environmental sustainability monitoring report. Your policy is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. So you'll see down under the interpretation, we've got a table in there. The table has a lot of TBD in there because the data doesn't exist. I haven't even put some of the interim targets in place. But if you look right above the table, under measures and standards of achievement, this is my interpretation. This is my target. Compliance in the next monitoring period will be demonstrated when we have a way of estimating our GHG emissions. We don't actually have that tool right now. And the following table is populated with interim milestones, targets, and dates. So for this year, you don't have a way to look backward and say, how did the last monitoring period go? But this is the first time we've done this policy. But you can judge the acceptableness, whether that A and B in the next monitoring period meets the threshold of any reasonable interpretation. And a lot of this, I don't want to split too many hairs, but a lot of this just comes down to, does it pass the sniff test with you guys? We can go down any rabbit hole quite a ways. At a certain point, are you satisfied or not?
Again, I want to kind of have an idea of what to expect as reports transition to this. So on things, again, I could see for things in the past where there has been a measurable standard, we have had a measurable standard, but we have not had interim targets. For instance, like with the buses, like what, that in that particular instance, we happen to know that you could go to the budget to say what your target was. That is something. But I'm thinking there may not be that clear evidence of what the interim target was. And
The first time I introduce a 1-year target
Yeah.
for the bus stops, it will not have been set a year before.
Well-
So you'll have a hard time judging how I did over that period. I agree, that's a little bit of a transitionary.
Yeah.
And we have to futz our way through that.
so maybe we just, if we need to be prepared for a certain amount of growing pains and uncertainty for the first monitoring period, then I just want to make sure that we all understand
Oh,
that that's what that's what's that we're going to be dealing with that, and hopefully won't have this long conversation each time.
I would certainly appreciate your patience with us as we work to do this. And getting into the environmental monitoring report may be a good example of some of the challenges and hiccups and bumps we are encountering. I will say some of the other monitoring reports, we may not need the interim targets as much. Again, if it's a yes, no sort of interpretation, and either it is or it isn't. So I don't expect interim targets everywhere. I want to be clear about that, but I would appreciate your patience as we sort of figure out the best way, whether it's modifying your survey tools or just how we think about them.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Mel. If there are no other questions or comments, we'll go ahead and move on directly to the environmental sustainability policy 2.11, which is what started this mess, man.
Perhaps one of the things, yes, but there were hints otherwise. Okay, so thank you. If you turn to page 40, we can begin to look at this first monitoring report for this new policy. We've had similar policies in the ends reports. You will notice some similarities coming forward. A couple of things. The service committee did review an earlier version of the survey that had fewer responses. They did not make a recommendation. They wanted more responses in the survey, so we allowed more time. And they wanted to have, I think, more of a discussion with all of you about how to grade this particular monitoring report. So key points from the report, from the board survey and from staff, I think, are relevant here. So this is the first attempt at monitoring an entirely new policy. So due to the timing of the period and the introduction of the policy, and frankly, the lack of certain methodological tools, this is really focused on setting targets for the next period. That example of A and B that I gave you, that's my goal. That's what you should be. Is that a reasonable goal? So to populate these entire tables with actual targets and data is what I'm saying is reasonable at this first step. Obviously, I won't repeat that next year. Next year, it's going to be just the table and the projections or targets, if you will. One of the things we looked into here in previous years, you may remember when this was more of an ends. Part of my evidence was fuel consumption. I told you I can't measure emissions directly. I don't want to incur the costs of estimating it. So I'm just going to give you fuel consumption, because fossil fuel burning is what creates carbon emissions. So the less of it we burn, it must be better. Which was a bit of a, you could question that chain of logic, but I think it was a reasonable step. Looking at this policy more closely, you were very specific about emissions. And you also had another policy that was very much about the volume of fuel consumed. So we needed to switch to actually measuring emissions. So that's the methodological tool we lack. We are looking into ways we can do cost-effective calculations of emissions. But that's the tool we need before I can populate this table. And to give you an idea of the complexity of it, when you have 103 buses that are almost all different ages, some of which have different propulsion systems. Do I just multiply by an average? Well, it gets a little messy. It's just one car, it's one thing. So we want to try to find a way to grapple with that, to give you a better estimate. I'm not going to try to directly measure emissions. I'm going to be honest with you, like tailpipe probes and every exhaust pipe is cost prohibitive as a measurement tool, but we are going to try to get you a better estimating tool that we would all find reliable, acceptable, so piece about it. So developing that tool is part of what we need to do over the next year. Okay. We're trying to keep the focus on the outcome rather than the activities. We had an earlier version of this that was very much focused on the activities. This doesn't seem right. We need to come back to, this is a policy about GHG emissions. Let's make it just focused on the emissions, not the how we're going to get there. This is where we get to the cross-referencing with the business plan. If you want to hear more about how are you going to do that, Mr. Carpenter, I would refer you over to the business plan rather than gum up the monitoring report process. You'll get your answer, but it just keeps the monitoring report from getting sidetracked in that space. Nevertheless, we got some good suggestions in the board survey for activities, and we certainly made note of all of those. From the board survey, one of you wrote, these policies are very complex, difficult to measure, and overlapping. Therefore, these policies should be rethought and revised. And there were several comments in there that 211.1 and 211.2 seem to sit on exactly the same space. 211.1 is about GHG emissions, and 211.2 is about carbon emissions and neutrality. But carbon is a GHG. So we kind of had to split a big hair there about, are we answering it all in one or leaving the other one blank? How do we do? And it's messy. I'm not going to lie to you. This is an awkward solution. This interpretation is weird and it does feel redundant. And these tables look almost exactly the same. That's on purpose. I'm not trying to bamboozle anybody. It's just the first one's about emissions and the second one's about a different kind of emissions. You wrote two separate policies and I had to put something in both categories. There is some confusion in the board survey about that. There's also some confusion between the volume of energy used and the degree of emissions that's being produced. But I think that's more of a unit measure kind of a question. So what you see broadly in here is the interpretations for each of them, tables that indicate that we're going to fill in with the interim steps. The goals for eliminating GHGs and carbon emissions are always zero. We're assuming we're getting to zero. We have to populate the interim years, how we're going to do that. Energy consumption, we realize, look, we're always going to consume energy. So we're going to probably end up dropping down to a certain operational minimum, like optimized amount of energy we're consuming. But then it isn't going to be able to drop any further because we need to consume energy to make vehicles go. What kind of energy to be determined. And the amount of waste we produce, again, is going to hit, it's not going to go to zero. We're going to produce some amount of waste. But trying to optimize that as much as we can is probably the target we're going to generate. And I think that sort of summarizes our first attempt to provide interpretations and how we're going to answer this question. So I'm happy to open it up for discussion, Madam Chair.
First of all, I'd like to thank the 7 board members who participated in the survey and note that some people seem to find the survey relatively easy to handle. It went from 15 minutes to 70 minutes to quickly say it. So I think that speaks volumes about how hard the board is looking to understand this new paradigm and this new policy. And with that, I would like to open it up to the board for questions or comments to see about the policy. Later on in our agenda, we will cover whether or not we have any discussion on the policies themselves, but for right now, we're just talking about the monitoring portion. Any questions or comments?
Yes, well, I'm not sure which bucket this falls in, but based on this feedback, are we going to get like a revised interpretation report before a year from this is an annual report, right? Yeah, before the next annual report, or so we ensure this is like, hey, I want to get it for you guys, get the feedback, we get another revision.
if you are unsatisfied with my interpretations, I'd rather mean that. You know, I don't want to go through all the exercise of filling in these tables and then have you guys tell me that doesn't cut it. But the intent is if you are satisfied with the general interpretations, then yes, the next monitoring period, the goal I'm setting is that I will fill in all those tables, including the interim targets.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that part I'm okay with. I mean, you had some comments here around for some folks, I was wondering, I thought that the 2.11.1 and 2.11.2 overlap. I know you discussed that just then, but I also had a comment, for instance, around waste, where I thought actually that
2114.
yeah, 2.11 for potentially split into two. And so I don't know if there's a dispute. Is that part of the discussion for the second part? Or is that?
Yeah, we're talking about the policies themselves and whether or not we're satisfied that they're written in the way that we wish them to move forward. That discussion will happen later on in the agenda. This is just specifically surrounding the monitoring report.
I interpreted, I had a question mark on that one. I think that's a question about my interpretation.
Yes.
So you're asking why the table is structured the way it is. So, and I actually put a question mark on that. I would like to know more about what you thought behind the writing.
Because it felt like that.
That is on page 48.
I don't know, that was actually not 2.11.4, that's 2.11.3. Yeah, 2.11.3.
Just page.
Operate page 47 in the packet. So that was operate without a process that minimizes material energy consumption and provide for proper disposal of waste. And it was primarily, I think a lot of it was like consumption, for instance, of fuel and fluids. And then you have like tonnage of waste as part of that separate column. In my view, like you talked about, like, hey, we're going to hit like a plateau of like minimal fuel usage. But for me, like waste includes like trash and consumption of stuff that even just like an office. And I feel like that is like an important measure because once we hit, especially with the hybrid vehicles and these high efficiency approaches to how our fleet runs and sport vehicles, that trash piece, I think, is something that we could actually probably have a bigger impact. Because I don't know how many bins of trash we consume or provide like every month. But I feel like that's something that maybe might be better off measured separately because that's something that we can have, I think, a continual impact on.
What are you thinking about in terms of measuring it separately? What I wrote was admittedly the highest level. I said tonnage. I mean, come on, tonnage. You know, that we're talking dumpsters. How many dumpsters full of garbage are we talking about? I would suggest that probably clears the threshold of any reasonable interpretation. But if you're thinking, you know, can we go deeper? Then I think this is a conversation worth having.
Yeah,
and I'd love to know.
Yeah, because like for me, it wasn't just like this general trash, but as we, for instance, build the YTC, there are approaches that in construction we can maybe hold the feet to the fire or construction partners saying like you need to make sure you're also minimizing, right? Because I'll use an example. When I put wood floors into my house, I actually did the work myself, and I went to the wooden place, and they're like, "Oh, take your square footage you need and add 40%." I'm like, "Oh crap, what is that for?" They're like, "Oh, because of all the waste." And I'm like, "Well, I'm gonna play like Tetris," and I managed to like really reduce the amount of waste on it. But that was something I put the effort in. And I think construction industry in general, they're very much like, depending on the cost, we're like, oh yeah, you know, 2x4 is cheap. We'll just throw all this stuff out instead of recycling and using it. And if we, as part of long range plan, there's not just a YTC, there's other hubs that we're thinking of building. And so that's the part where like the actual tonnage of waste can actually have a pretty big impact.
We're talking tons there for sure.
And that's something I need a response now. It's just something that I was thinking of like we have a lot of stuff based around fuel and other fluids, but like tonnage of waste, I feel like is a continually moving target. Whereas I feel like the gallons of diesel fuel, natural gas use will, well, diesel fuel will decline. natural gas maybe will increase depending on what we do for our next things, but the outputs into the environment impact, I think, should actually hopefully be declining based on our efforts for environmental sustainability. But the tonnage of waste can be all over the place, like year by year at least. I think who brought up leads? I think you brought up leads. You probably did brand leads. You brought it up. You called it out. I mean, that's something that as part of when Forrest's team was working with selections of potential builders, we can be like, hey, this is something that you need to, we can use as evaluation criteria for selection.
Yeah, it seems like maybe that's part of the target that we are setting. And if the target is not going in a direction that the board finds acceptable, even, considering, hey, I'm knocking down the terminal and spending tons of concrete, then you could reasonably ask for an explanation. Are you incentivizing the contractor to reduce waste or something along those lines? I don't think that's an unreasonable conversation. I hadn't actually thought of this in terms of construction debris. I was thinking more of it in terms of dumpster loads out of the regular operations, which, with us actively tracking the sheer volume of it or the mass of it and putting it on this number, that we were also going to go into our procurement process. And there's the Gantt chart and the business plan, there's a project for updating procurement guidelines. One of the things was going to be about waste. Hey, the board's given us a goal of reducing waste. Mr. Supplier, can you tell us about how much waste is produced with your product? And that was something we're thinking about building into the procurement process, because that would pretty much cover everything that we use. And everything has to go through a procurement process. So that was kind of how we were thinking about dealing with it. And I think your question, your example there, Rich, is something that I would probably think about building into that procurement process. Forrest and I have talked about the expectations for new facility construction in regard to this one. How carbon neutral should the YTC be? And he and I have already agreed that in the planning process, every planning process will specifically ask that question now. That's not something we really did as intentionally before. Geared towards finding, frankly, the sweet spot between environmental impact and cost, because we can have no impact, but at a cost that probably makes the project unaffordable. So there's a sweet spot in there somewhere, and Forest Group now has to find that for each new project. And I guess we can apply that to demolition costs too. I haven't really considered that, but I think the same logic could apply there. But again, that would go into the business plan process. The metric in here is, you said, reduced material waste. And I'm telling you, tonnage is how I would propose to measure that.
We have two requests for discussion. Julie, is yours new or is it to add to what? It's yeah. Okay, then I'd like to go to Sue because I think she's gonna finish up this, but not. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to Sue so that you can help with this, and then we'll go on to Julie.
Yeah, so Rich has expressed a concern, but the big question is this a shared concern among the board? Because Matt can do all sorts of gyrations to satisfy one board member's request, but that's not the nature of this work. It is, are there other members of the board that share Rich's concern that would cause then, to relook at, incorporating that issue of either construction, trash, or, that kind of thing. So establishing whether this is a shared concern. If it is a shared concern, that would then cause Matt to have to think further about it. If it's not a shared concern and the rest of the board says, what's in front of us it meets the test of any reasonable interpretation for me, that's what needs to rule the day.
So looking at this, and again, if we need to postpone this conversation, I'm totally comfortable with that. I think that the term carbon neutrality is a lot more complex than carbon emissions, which is what, you know, the interpretation is talking about carbon emissions, but the term carbon neutrality captures a lot of policy issues, right? It's like increasing ridership is contributing to carbon neutrality. And I want Cindy to correct me about that. You know, bus rapid transit, supporting that policy could be related to achieving carbon neutrality. So I don't know if we just need to change the language, because to me, the carbon neutrality is kind of this umbrella goal, and then there are these other goals underneath it. So I think that may be where the struggle is, perhaps.
So what you're saying is that you're thinking that the board needs to look at changing policy language, which is different than the current policy monitoring.
Yeah. Okay, so it might be different time for the discussion, but I didn't love this thought. So
no, I appreciate that. No, since that's actually discussing policy language, which is future versus what's happened over the last year. Let's go back to this current monitoring report, and then we'll jump on that. Cindy, did you want to?
Yeah, well, I guess it was a response to that, which is policy discussion. But I think overall, I think more or less the interpretations work for the policy as it's written.
Right.
I think the point Rich brought up about construction and demolition waste, I don't see how that's not included in the policy we have written. And, you know, I think the point about working it into procurement guidelines makes sense to me. So I'm sort of on board with the interpretation we have here. And I think people have brought up good points around the policy and seeing how it's interpreted. I am in favor of some changes to the policy that we discuss.
Are there any other people who feel one way or the other about what's been presented? So far, we've just heard from two. So, with regards to moving forward on this, is a vote necessary? Because we've only heard from two people, so I'm not hearing the majority who are requesting this, which so it doesn't seem like it's the full board support.
Oh, can I just add a little more color or context to why I brought this up? So my request was actually just moving that tonnage of waste into its own separate table. And the reason why is I think there needs to be a little granularity with that one. For a couple of reasons. One, as I'm thinking about this from a monitoring standpoint and interpretation, is that I can potentially see electricity use, natural gas, miles per gallon use of that always like hitting targets for tonnage of waste. Like I think I mentioned it, like I'm not an environmental expert, but I just think of all those just dumps that you see, just mountains of just natural mount right. Well, US 23 is just our effect of that from just a trash standpoint of just general everyday kind of stuff and construction piece. And so I was envisioning that tonnage of waste, that one's going to be potentially sometimes yellow, red, green, depending on, whereas I feel like the other two columns are always going to be green. I didn't want to get into a case where this one's always showing like yellow or not keeping gold, because that tonnage of waste is breaking everything else down in that particular function.
So we're talking about, because I can set the targets, you know, by next year for these interim steps. And I can just factor in how heavy is the YTC. Let's assume we truck it out. And I can build that into the target. I can probably make some sophisticated guesses about how much of that building might be reusable or, you know, some other way to eliminate just it as material waste. I can build that into the target. So again, in advance. So that when we're monitoring that period, you'll know whether or not I hit that target. It might be green, might be yellow. That's different than breaking that tonnage of waste into more granular areas. Like, I don't think recycling would count as waste. Like, I wouldn't count that as tonnage of material waste because it's being reused. So the only things thrown away. So I wouldn't count that in here. But we're talking about the tonnage of waste and breaking that down. That would be construction and demolition debris, office supplies, but probably the largest chunk would be, do we count a used up bus as waste? What about all the parts? You know, you pull, the mechanics are in the back, they'll pull out a transmission or an engine. And at the time, it's got tens of thousands of miles, like 800,000 miles on it, I think. And at that point, it's toast. There's no reusable value in that machine. I think it's just scrapped. I don't know that we recycle a transmission. So those are really heavy pieces of land. That's the kind of thing that's going to drive up the tonnage. And there's going to be just a certain ambient amount of that until we get rid of that kind of equipment. How much a fuel cell waste?
Well, I mean, let's just leave it the way it is. You see how it turns out. But I mean, I appreciate that you are measuring that. So yeah, I think I'll just try to apply a cost.
But you've given me a lot to think about on this. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a very interesting perspective. So thank you for bringing that up. Are there any other questions for Matt about the monitoring report itself? And if not, does anyone want to make a recommendation as to how we accept this report? Yes, Mike.
I have to say, I wonder, this is so brand new, complicated, man. I understand there's been so much difficulty finding data and evaluating and so forth. I mean, various people said in the comments, work in progress, and certainly the work in progress. I'm just wondering whether we should just give Matt a pat on the back and say, keep up the good work, but I don't know, trying to fit our comments into this matrix of how we're accepting it, with various exceptions and so forth. It just seems to be that.
It is very complex. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need to be cognizant of, like, this is a heavy lift on the staff lately. This is another big section that we're have just in this discussion alone, kind of gone down a few different rabbit holes. And so our decisions collectively impact the already robust workload that I'm seeing. So I would, you know, propose that we accept the draft as is and see how things play out over the next 12 months when I guess when the rubber meets the road and we've got charts full of information. So
we have a motion on the floor to accept the report as A. This is our first report. Do I have anybody seconding that? That would be Rich. Is there any discussion on that motion itself? Seeing none, let's go ahead and vote. All those in favor of accepting the report as A for the first report, please raise your hands. And that passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. And Matt, we do understand how difficult this first report has been. And it's hard to get data out of thin air if it's not our there. So I think we made a great decision. Now we're going to move on to the policy language discussion that was brought up about this. Julie, did you want to repeat what you had said about the policies?
I was really just responding to the question about the duplicative nature of the charts and right, because I do think they're interested, but, and then with the carbon neutrality, or maybe either, are we comfortable with that term? Or is it too complex, and what we really want is something measuring carbon emissions, and then understanding that most of these goals are trying to get us to carbon neutrality, and so that might be an easy fix, but I would want to defer that inverts. More about this.
Cindy, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because you were on the committee that helped to develop this policy. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think first of all, to respond to the piece about sort of BMT and all these other things playing into carbon neutrality, I think that's more community-wide carbon neutrality, whereas this was looking at the organization as a whole, the emissions that result from the organization, and that's what we were interested in when writing these policies. I think, I commented as well about the overlapping nature of the policies and, the added complexity because of that. I think the carbon neutrality policy came from a place of wanting to put in the ends that we got a carbon neutrality goal. And through, sort of the policy governance process, it became a very, structured policy. And now we're getting reports on it that really mirror what we had in the other policy about actually reduced emissions. So I know there might be conversations about, also moving this out of back into the ends as well. And if that's the case, I think we should really consider at the same time maybe removing one of these or modifying them in a way that you only have to produce that one table. And maybe have to report on these things.
Any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm glad that somebody brought that up. We actually kind of identified from the start of the public safety conversation that this was probably going to lead into a reassessment of the carbon neutrality as probably an end statement, or really as a, that we needed to define the goals of carbon neutrality, what our environmental goals were before we could then have executive limitations on that. So I actually might suggest that the service committee take on establishing an an ends policy before we start working on and focus on that, like in of itself. And I've certainly will use the executive limitations out. I have no interest in redoing the work that's already been done, but I do want to build in it. And then after that, maybe reassessing the executive limitations, kind of see where that goes. That's kind of my thought, to have it as a two-step process, kind of what we've been doing with the public safety policy of focusing on an end statement. And then,
is there any support to what Jesse has just suggested? Yes, Mike.
Yeah, I think it's a very good suggestion. I know there was discussion and disagreement when we first talked about having a policy like this and whether it should be in the ends. And I think there was a lot of disagreement about that, because I personally think it would be better in the ends. But I think what Jesse just suggested is a two-step. First of all, take a look at the policy and does it belong in the executive limitations. With these kind of different limitations, shouldn't that be coming out of something else like ends? And it also seems like it just resulted in much more work than I had expected Matt would have to be doing. And so maybe by focusing on the ends first and focusing on where we should be monitoring this, or where it should be in our policy, might lead us to a somewhat different conclusion, and one that is burdensome.
I hear what everyone is saying, and it's a hefty amount of work, and hearing that we're thinking about just putting it back to the odds makes my heart a little bit sad, because there has been an awful lot of work on staff's end. I do see some value in the policy that's written, but I also agree that there is a lot of overlap, and maybe there's a way to do both. And if the board is amenable to Jesse's generous suggestion that the service committee take on looking at environmental sustainability and and incorporating it into the ends, but then trying to immediately look at 211, because my concern is I don't want to drag 211 out to the point where we're expecting them to do work that they may not need to do, and or to have a policy in place that really tells staff, tells the CEO what it is that we're really looking for. So is the board, would someone like to make a motion to allow the service committee to look at 211 first as adding ends language, but then to look at 211 with in mind with the concerns that we have about the overlap and the complexity of the policies as they're written? Would someone like to make a motion for that? Is that a clear motion, or did we have to do that? I can restate it. So I'll make the motion. I would like to make a motion. Is that it? Like, can I do that as a chair? I will make a motion that the service committee take on the work of looking at sustainability as a possible ends policy. And then once they establish that and get back to the board, then we would move on to re-looking at policy 2.11 through the service committee and seeing about those challenges that we've seen about overlap and all the concerns that were brought up this thing. Is the board seconded by Cindy, or you have a question?
I think it's gonna be pretty tough to do the ends without considering the changes to this executive limitation policy. So I support that. I think we should come back with a suggestion for how to fit this into ends, and also how 211 should be modified.
So, yeah, but maybe we can do one and then the other. That's going to have to happen at the same time. Yeah, I'm amenable for that. And I guess I'll look to the other member of the service committee, president.
So there's a motion.
I'll just ask for patience from the board. We do have other policy work on it, but you know, I think this is the only other option would be to form a task force if we were concerned about timeliness. Maybe we should have a task force formed, and we should reform the environmental sustainability task force. Is there a concern about timeliness?
So there's a discussion on the motion now in order that it either goes to the service committee or we form the task force to come up. Would anybody like to entertain a discussion that you want to maintain service committee, or do you want to form the task force?
Yes, it's fine on the service committee. Even if parts of this change and move a little bit, I think generally the board's intentions are captured in the policy we have currently, and the interpretation you gave, and the sort of pathway you're on is correct for that. So in my mind, you can continue with that piece of it while we work on working the policy a little bit, and therefore I don't think it's something we need to turn around. Is
there any other discussion on the motion? So the motion stands and it will be the service committee. All those in favor, raise your hands. All right, that passed. Thank you so much. We knew it was going to be a stickler when it came to us, that we appreciate your patience, and thank you to the board for all the hard work on that. It's a beast of a policy, but it's so important. So thank you everyone for your thoughtfulness. We're going to move on to the safety policy 5.2, and that's Mr. Just.
Yeah, so I want to start off by saying I was not able to attend, let alone chair the last service committee meeting. I'd really like to thank Rich for stepping up. I had some family matters that I needed to attend to. I was able to review the meeting, and it was a fantastic discussion. I had no doubts going into it. I just regrets that I wasn't going to be able to participate. So as a reminder from last month, there was agreement on the board that we were on the right track, but we hadn't, that the language options were, neither of the language options were quite sufficient in terms of defining particularly the for whom element of our safety policy. Who are we trying to get? And I will do my best to fairly represent the conversation that was had at the service committee that I simply watched. But there was a lot of conversation about are we getting at, we just want to address the safety of customers, or do we want to, and there was also a question of where, like making sure, we want people to feel safe on the buses, but do we care about whether people feel safe as they are traversing the sidewalk in front of a bank? So, because we do not want to put the agency in charge of the overall mental health of everybody everywhere.
Thank you.
Now, so there were some conversation. I actually, after while listening to or watching the conversation, had some of my own thoughts. As it's a good discussion should prompt other thoughts. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to talk to Rich and Simi individually about this between the meeting and this meeting. Because so if you look at your packet, the coming out of the service committee, there was a decision that the language that part of the proposed that we were going to bring back that riders feel physically and psychologically safe. And there was a sense that was setting an appropriate scope, that it was not being too expansive the way members of the traveling public feel physically and psychologically safe. The term members of the traveling public was intentionally broad because in other policies it's talking about people's like for instance the pedestrian going through a pedestrian crossing while a bus is also going through there. That person is we do have policies to cover that person. Even though they are not actively using transportation services. And we were, that's the language in your packet. And I am actually going to propose something else because as I was listening to the conversation and listening to all the ideas that were being put out there, I became concerned that by saying riders, that we were only directing this at people who are already using our services. And the point, the reason that we had initially addressed this policy, or we've been talking a lot about this in terms of our global end of wanting to expand, of wanting to increase ridership. And we're talking about a perception of safety as a barrier to expanding ridership. And so if this policy only covers riders, it's not actually getting at the people that it was really geared to, or at least it's not getting to everyone. So, so for instance, the person who decides not to ride the bus because they don't consider it safe is not a rider and thus not covered by the policy, unless we're entrusting the CEO to interpret it more beyond that. So the conversations that we had then were talking about, well, do we want to set a specific, do we want to do it to fit like a very defined term and hope that the CEO, you know, understands us and broadens that definition? Or should we set a broader term and trust that the CEO will limit it? Neither of those are like great. We're putting a lot of, there's to be a lot of fluctuation over time. So in the course of my conversation with Rich, I came up with the language, public transportation services are perceived as safe. So the for who becomes the entire, you know, it does, the who is maintained at everyone in that it's not, we don't specify it. So, but the scope becomes limited in terms of what we are putting the CEO in charge of. We are no longer putting the CEO in charge of a person's overall feeling of safety. We are putting them in charge of their feeling of safety as they interact with transportation services. So, and we were talking about, does the term public transportation services include, is that broad enough without being, is that sufficiently broad without being too broad? So does that cover buses? I think that's pretty clear. It covers all of our vehicles. But does that cover a bus stop, which is another, that's a main barrier for a lot of people to using our services? Do they feel safe waiting for the bus? And that's something that we do have, that I think we did want to take a certain amount of responsibility for. And I think we were, you know, in our own minds thinking that a reasonable interpretation of that would include bus stops, would include the transit center, basically any sort of point of interaction, which, you know, with transportation services. And also, you know, they don't have to actually have boarded the bus in order to be covered. And thus it addresses that goal of wanting to increase ridership because someone's perception of transportation services is important to whether or not they use them. So that's not written down in the packet, but that is both Rich and Simi were on board with that language. And I think that's the language that we would like to put before the rest of you. Sorry, Susan. She was at the meeting and I did not have a chance to talk to her before throwing this out there.
Can I ask you to repeat the language you're proposing?
Okay, so the language is public transportation services are perceived as safe.
Does anyone on the board have any questions or concerns or dialogue on this change? Yeah.
I'm not on the board, but
No, I said anyone. Anyone.
so, pardon me, just a sudden change. The intent here was to cover riders and potential riders.
Yes, because we were looking to address people who were not riding because there was a perception that public transportation was not safe or safe for them.
Yeah, I guess we need a little more context because we had originally said riders, and then in our discussion we're like, well, maybe we should proceed that with prospective riders, because those are the ones that frankly are the ones that are going, I'm not sure I really want to ride the AAA because I'm not sure I feel safe. And then we said, okay, well, can we actually bring this higher up? Which is why we said, okay, maybe, because the two components where we've all been debating, right? It's like the whom and where. And we're like, well, can we actually eliminate the where? Because in reality, a potential use case is just general public person that's in their house thinking about the AAA TA. they're a prospective rider, and it could be that they're not a rider because they're not, they don't perceive us as being a safe option for transportation. And so that was one of the aspects, which is why we're like, okay, how far up can we get generalized, which is why, you know, what public transportation services, which is what we provide, are perceived as safe.
So you're trying to abstract it off.
Yeah.
That's it.
Susan has her hand up, Sue.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to the language that's been presented, but it does pose some challenges in terms of placement in the ends policies. As I've mentioned to you before, I think we kind of need to reframe the broader statements beyond having access. So if you went with that other language, we would need to rethink the placement within the ends policies.
May I ask, do you have any initial thoughts of that placement? Looking at the ends right now.
I was looking at 1.2, and you know, because those particular you know, thinking about positive impacts in the environment, and obviously if public transportation services, if you know, if it is perceived as safe, that would have a positive impact from the social perspective in the environment. So it, you know, from a parallel construction opportunity, 1.2 is a possibility, but we would still need to modify the broadest policy in that. And as I said, you know, in 1.1, it needs some work in order to incorporate all of the, you know, it's beyond access at this point, the you know, the feeling of safety. So it's going to need, those broader statements are going to need to have some modification when we get to it in January or February, whenever we're doing that.
So that kind of sounds like the issue is like grammatical, because I mean it's not just grammar, but like it's conceptual. That is that just because we talk about access in one as opposed to what public transportation is in 1.2? Because I think
you know, I'm looking at 1.4 right now. You know, I'm thinking as I'm speaking here. 1.4 is a possibility that it could go under 1.4. Just because, you know, where passengers are highly satisfied with public transportation services, and then you got, you know, public transportation services is perceived as safe, that there's a relational piece there that it wouldn't be a big leap.
So we've informally discussed, and I'm going to preface this so no one freaks out, including our chair, by saying this is not something that we're planning on doing. And we know we have a plan for when we're going to do it. I'm not introducing this, but that it's been pointed out that the idea that in 1.1 that the end is stated of having equitable access to public transportation is not actually what we want. We want we're not here to provide access to public transportation. We're here to provide public transportation. And so that is a question that we will be dealing with. That if 1.1 were to be rephrased as public transportation services enable full participation in society, you know, removing that access component, that seems pretty clear, like that for me, what we're going for is that this would then belong under 1.1.
Yeah.
And so I don't really want to put it under 1.4 just because 1.1 is anachronistically phrased. I feel like in terms of philosophically, we're talking about, you know, a higher level end. And I don't know how problematic it would be if we were to store it under 1.1 as initially planned, even though it's phrased differently.
Yeah.
There are two concerns being talked about here, and you're bringing up the issue about the wording of access. That has not gone through the whole board to see if the board would like to even address that situation. So, I think what we need to do is concentrate on the public safety and then add the additional conversation.
So I'm trying to get clarity on, like, to me, it sounded like the reason why it might go better under 1.4 is because it matches the phrasing better. Or because 1.1 as currently talks about providing access. The safety policy does not talk about providing access to safe transportation. I don't think we want it to talk about providing access to safe transportation. But it is dealing with the nature of the transportation that we want to be provided. And that it's not really so much with customer satisfaction.
Jeff, yeah, I agree with you. And, and again, that it's just like the environmental sustainability piece that we were just talking about. We got to look at the whole thing. You can't, because there are some issues inside a fragment, a piece of it. So to look at the whole picture and have it make sense. I appreciate that, how you frame that in terms of, that the transportation services allow people to fully participate in society, and then talk about what, you've got 1.1 and 1.2 full flow from that. And I think we could, use the language of the safety language, then, it makes logical and contextual sense to do that. If we, look at that broader policy and expand it beyond just access.
How problematic is it if 1.1 doesn't change? If it continues to say access,
Mm-hmm.
To me that's not a problem. I have a hard time seeing how that would be problematic, but
That's not.
I wanted to ask more questions about the specific language change. I'm more interested in thinking behind that than which cover we try to shove it in. And I can't, have to apologize. As the guy who's got to write the interpretations, I would like to know more sort of the thinking behind it, because one of the things that has to be done is some sort of description for who. And if you are not clear as a body in the policy, then that means you kicked it down to me. I've got to try to answer part of that question in my interpretation somehow. So riders, prospective riders, I feel like with that, you're giving me fairly clear direction about who you intend this to refer to. With the language you propose, public transportations are perceived as safe. Services are perceived as safe. You're not specifying who. You have abstracted it up very high. And I'm going to have to come up with an interpretation that says, well, who is perceiving it as safe? Because I got to give you a measure of that. And going back to where I think this started was the presence or absence of law enforcement personnel. And then some people felt their presence made them feel unsafe, and other people felt their absence made them feel unsafe.
did you have any trouble finding? So we have another 1.2. Public transportation positively, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't say that one actually has a pronoun, but 1.2.1, public transportation options are increasingly chosen over use of a personal car.
That wasn't too hard because it's car users.
So if they're perceived as, but I guess I'm wondering, but car users, all car users?
We break that down. I'm trying to remember how exactly we say it in Ken's report. I think we focus on commuters, then also all mode share. So yeah, effectively, we're trying to segment the market a little bit
while also covering all of them. But that's also partially limited to the data that's available.
But I just don't, so,
but in that one, the implicit one in there is get people out of their cars. Well, who's in their cars? People who are in the cars. So like I can write an interpretation of that group of people, and I can identify and I can measure something about them.
Mm-hmm.
With public transportation services are perceived as safe, you haven't identified by who, so I'll have to.
or if it's a sub-policy of 1.1 that says residents in the area have equitable access to public transportation, doesn't the term residents in the area apply to the sub-policies unless otherwise defined?
Yeah. But could I then come up with a reasonable interpretation that says, if I do a telephone survey and the majority of them say it's safe, I've cleared the any reasonable interpretation bar. I guess what I'm asking is, who do you want this focused on? And I felt like with riders and like prospective riders, I knew what you wanted. With public services are perceived as safe. I mean, I know what you're talking about, right? Like I hear what you're saying right around the table.
I feel like I'm trying to do you a favor. I guess. Who's not, who isn't a prospective rider?
Well, I like rider, and I was gonna come up with an interpretation of that pretty broadly. I like looking for the word perspective. Thank you. That's very. There's a distinction in my mind between people who are already customers on the bus, people who are thinking about using it, perspective, and people who are just hanging around the terminal. There's the distinction in my mind that if someone is loitering, because I mean, like that's kind of where being back to the law enforcement question, the safety issue kind of comes to a head. That's where I begin to distinguish who you intended this policy to apply to. Does it apply to people waiting at a bus stop out on e-course? Absolutely. Prospective rider. Even if they're not physically on the bus, I would broadly interpret rider in this context to mean customer or potential customer. I like prospective customer even better. So I was kind of already thinking it was going to, because I heard what you're saying. I knew what you meant by rider. Anyone who could be a prospective rider or customer, but not the general public who might just happen to be walking by, as you said a few moments ago. So that in my mind gave me a fairly good sense of how that interpretation is going to come out, be focused on those populations. I can still do that with the new language, but there's a lot more on me taking a really big leap of what you meant, because your language has become less specific about who it was intended for. I may be overthinking stuff.
I think, no, I appreciate this. Because I think that gets into something else that we're going to be talking about. To what extent isn't the person loitering on the platform a prospective rider? And are we putting ourselves into a dangerous position by discriminating in that way, of saying this person's a prospective rider and you're not? And that's so it's an interesting question.
It really does come down to the for whom and at what cost kind of conundrum. Although not legal discrimination, I take your meaning in terms of, yeah, we're going to have to split some hairs. There's a person hanging out on the far end of the platform. They've been through 4 bus cycles. It's, I'll be honest, my staff know pretty well when someone is doing things they ought not to be, and they're not really there to ride a bus. But we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions about that. Lest we do create some sort of actual legal problem.
I also don't. Sorry, I don't know how you I don't know how you're going to measure prospective riders either. But that is really what we're trying to get to. We are trying to find out who's not riding the bus because they don't feel safe. or we are trying to make sure that that situation doesn't exist.
So I would like to intervene here because I think originally the hope was that we were going to come to some sort of decision on policy language. I'm feeling that this dialogue is beneficial, but that I believe that now we've shown that I think it needs to go back to the service committee to come to us with a specific language, where, when, whom, and what cost, because now we're brainstorming here in a board meeting. I don't know how the board members feel though. Are you feeling one way or the other about these policies? Do you want to continue this conversation and make a decision tonight? Or are you confused enough that you think that the service committee should come back with a more targeted and formulated approaches to the language? Yes.
Suggestion that, maybe can we, I mean, would it be acceptable to just say, for now, public transportation services are perceived as safe by riders and prospective riders? At least we get something done, paper approved, and then we can discuss if we need to abstract up more from that. Because like for me, the whole prospective riders, if someone loitering, I mean, you might be loitering today, but maybe tomorrow they're actually big important ones. I mean, there are bus channels are also, so I don't want to.
Julie, we do have language that we use around moral and legal owners, and I don't know if that's helpful in this context to use the language that we use in similar contexts or not. I don't want to make it more complicated. I'm totally fine with what you're suggesting, Rich. And really, to me, it comes down to, is staff comfortable understanding how to interpret the policy?
I think I would be prepared to put before the board the language. Public transportation services are perceived by prospective riders, or rather, sorry, prospective riders perceive public transportation services as safe. Because I think we don't need to, I don't think we need to see a prospective rider. That's who we're really, that is actually who I think we're trying to reach. And when they become riders, they will assume remain that, keep that perception. So
I don't feel comfortable with that language because the ends specifically talk about current riders and prospective riders, and I would be more comfortable saying that riders and prospective riders are the public transportation services are perceived as safe by riders and prospective riders. I don't want to cut riders out. I don't feel comfortable with that, but I might be the only one who doesn't.
where do we differentiate between those two?
You just said, when you were talking about language, you only said prospective riders, you didn't say riders.
I guess I was channeling my inner Kyra, and that made up saying that the term riders was redundant was encompassed by prospective riders. And thus I was trying to keep the language streamlined. That was all it was.
Understood. But I think it's important to have the dialogue.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
So
Joe.
I agree with you. I mean, someone might not have a choice to use the services and still feel unsafe, and it's our goal for them to feel safe. So.
But isn't that person a prospective rider?
No, they might be a current rider, but if you have to use it, whether you feel safe or not, I'd rather have them use it and feel safe.
Oh, so you like they're forced to sound.
Yeah. Right.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So if we were to amend what Jesse is proposing to, public transportation services are perceived as safe by riders and prospective riders.
I think the only change I would make is in terms of keeping it consistent with the format of the rest of our ends policies, is I would put the for whom first, because we do tend to do that. We say residents. If I'm looking at our policies, they going down the list, they start with residents, people with, which is loosely defined, loosely defined. But we do, for the most part, when the for whom is explicit, it is always leading, it's always starting the sentence.
So I was just building off of what
Yeah,
you had.
yeah, and so I would say, riders and prospective riders perceive public transportation services as safe.
So Jesse's just made a motion that we say riders and prospective riders. Say that again. I don't have it written down. Okay, right, wait, what? Good Lord, riders and prospective riders perceive public transportation as safe.
Public transportation services.
Services as safe. Jesse has made a motion. Rich has seconded the motion. Is there any discussion on the motion itself? Yes, Mike.
We had this discussion earlier about where to fit it. And that hasn't been resolved. It sounds like it's kind of shoehorned in someplace.
Sorry.
Maybe would have to be modified, the other policy. I don't see why we wouldn't put this as just in 1.6 rather than trying to put it into 1.2.
That's actually not a bad idea, and I do have to remind everyone that in 2025, we are going to be sitting down for a day talking about our ends and exploring them very in depth. So we've had the opportunity to maybe make a 1.6 have it be standalone and takes care of the conundrum about access. However, if you feel 1.1.3 is a better way of doing it, which way, Jesse, do you want to propose?
I would prefer it as 1.13. I feel rather strongly that it's an elaboration of the goal of 1.1.
Any other discussion on? So the motion stands as written, and it would be 1.1.3. Any further discussion? All right, so it's proposed by Jesse, seconded by Rich. All those in favor, raise your hands. Very good. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I assume that I would have had this conversation in the service committee if I had been there. But,
well, it was a lot of work, but I think that we're heading in the right direction with this public safety issue and yeah. So thank you everyone for your hard work on that. And we do have a really big agenda in front of us. So let's go ahead and continue on that. I have no idea how you may want to consider maybe trying to compact some things. Next on our agenda is the YGC updates. 7.1 is Mr. Yang.
Hello.
it's still there.
Oh,
moving on to 7.2.
Are you ready?
We're ready. Thank you so much, Forrest.
With some operation updates. Actually, though my name on the agenda item, I would invite Gwen Johnson to do a presentation. But just quickly, a few words before Gwen Chan's presentation. I wasn't here back in May. Gwen Chan did a presentation, had a lot of conversation about this project. At that time, we proposed the street side concept. And kind of watched the recorded video, a lot of discussion about this concept. But again, now we are reaching to another project milestone about to introduce the recommended site plan based on the public stakeholder feedback and your feedback. And a lot of work went into it, city staff, and then of course our TheRide staff, and then the consulting team. I want to thank Jesse for working behind the scenes with city mayor and some of the key stakeholders in the city. So we finally agreed on the recommended site plan after all this evaluation process. On Tuesday, Jesse, Jeff, Gwen Chan, and I went to City Council. We had the same presentation. We didn't hear any concerns so far. But again, we want to give them a little more time to digest and then provide their feedback. Now I'm going to hand over to Gwen Chan Johnson for the presentation.
All right. Thank you for having me. I know we've already had a lot of discussion, so maybe don't have anything for me. I'm just kidding. So I wanted to give you an update on the YTC. I'll go through the beginning part here pretty quickly. This is just a progress update. We'll get to the fun stuff, which is that second bullet there, the site concept recommendation pretty quickly, and then the next steps. So we've completed a lot of work. We've been doing the project for 8 or 9 months. We used the 2018 study as our guide, and we've had a lot of discussion since then, starting with the November kickoff, which was internal, a lot of great feedback from our drivers and other staff members at TheRide. Throughout that, we've been kicking off or collaborating with the FTA. We introduced the project in January and February, and then I reported last time that we did receive the categorical exclusion decision, sort of our guidance for how to do our environmental review. So we had an official kickoff for the environmental review in May, even though we've been talking to them since January. Throughout that, we've been looking at the validation of that 2018 study and developing additional site concepts based on 2018. And then of course, in April and May, we did a really extensive public engagement and stakeholder engagement period that has really helped us come to you today with some with a recommendation. What we heard, this is kind of trying to distill all those conversations into one slide. So what we've heard so far, a lot of excitement for the new transit center, larger center, new center, really needed. Great news is we have the correct site, but not heard any, really anyone suggest that we should move to a different actual site. So the existing half block where the YTC is at will be the site moving forward. And then a lot of acknowledgement of how incredible this investment is for both us and the city of Ypsi. We, of course, haven't done a large capital project in quite some time. And also this will be one of the largest developments in the city of Ypsi. So a lot of excitement and acknowledgement of what an incredible opportunity this is. If you look at the kind of going a little bit deeper at the themes that we've heard throughout all of the engagement that we've done, safety and security rise to the top. We heard that from many people. So that kind of went without saying that we'll try to make we'll design a center that is safe. But I think it's such a huge thing in people's mind for the YTC that many people mentioned it. And then also accommodating growth. So the existing YTC was built in '93, so 30 years ago. And we reached capacity at it with our expansion back in 2014. And as we've grown since then, it's still functioning well, but we don't want to make a YTC that will be maxed out as soon as we build it. We want to be able to have some flexibility, is what we've heard. Certainly meet the needs of our long-range plan, but also think about how this can grow as we change and grow over time. A lot of interest in making it multimodal, particularly biking, but also in terms of other modes of transit, regional transit, and if we do some more on-demand type services, things like that, we've heard a lot of interest for. And then preservation, really talking more about the historic buildings on that block, and then also preserving that commercial on Washington. So there's a lot of interest in trying to, as much as we can to preserve that, as well as making a sustainable facility. Actually, this was more geared towards what we've heard so far is not, people don't want a huge heat island. And then the opportunity and balance there. We've heard a lot of discussion about what the transit center can be, what it can do. So really focus on the facility. They're just, I think everyone was really interested in the site concept, but they really wanted to jump to that next step of talking about what the transit center can be. And we'll get there. Right now, of course, we have to figure out what the site concept is. but just there's a lot of opportunity that we have here. And we will do everything we can to balance that with the resources that we have. So to get into the process very, very briefly, we developed a lot of concepts as a design team, created criteria that we all used to look at them. And then based on that 2018 work and the feedback and that scoring, we took 3 to the public to a wider audience, and these were the 3. You can see all the mini sticks of butter along here still. So sadly, those will go away in our next images here. But the idea behind this was not to have people choose a specific concept, but to get an idea of the what people like and dislike. So trying to combine the 3, in terms of the best ideas from each of the concepts. So based on that engagement, we really had 2 that were shortlisted, concept C and concept B, but we recognized that concept B had to have some modifications. So we came up with this alternate concept B1 we're calling, which I'll get into a lot of the details of the design in a second here. But the big one is that it did incorporate the buildings on Washington so that we do not have to demolish any of those historic or any of those commercial buildings, some of which are contributing to the historic character. And then we repeated that evaluation process using those criteria and looked at both B1 and C. And we had a lot of discussions after that. And after we did that scoring, we talked with, we spoke with a lot of people internally at TheRide, and then also the city of Ipsy. And as Forrest mentioned, we went to the city council on Tuesday. And this concept, B1, has risen to the top and is our recommendation for the site at Pearl and Adams in Washington. I'll give you a second just to kind of look at some of the details, and I'll go through the highlights and trade-offs, and we'll go back to this.
Would it be helpful if we dim the lights? I don't know if there's a
Yes, please.
Is that possible?
Thank you. No, I'm moving. Okay, so to take you through some of the highlights, this concept has the largest footprint for the building and platform area, which really goes back to that accommodating growth that we heard so much about from our engagement period, being able to really use it in a flexible nature. And then also creating that space for multimodal options, whether that be biking or the regional transit or other Uber, Lyft, things like that. We have a lot more opportunity here to use it in a very flexible way. And some of the concepts, if you remember, had the bus bays not quite on the platform, they were along the curb and close by. This one really maximizes the number of bus bays overall, as well as puts them all right on the platform surrounding the building. And then one of the biggest, as I mentioned, was that there is no demolition needed for the properties and buildings along Washington Street that exist today. It actually, so this concept, maybe not the best view here for this, but it actually also maximizes the leftover parking. We did not hear really any clamoring for maintaining a lot of parking. They really want to use this in this parking lot in a higher manner, in a better way. But it does give opportunity in terms of maximizing that large area left over. So the development potential for this concept, we felt after a lot of discussion that it activates the southeast corner right here at Pearl and Washington as soon as it's built. So it really brings that activity, sort of weights it more towards Washington as well as Michigan Ave just south of here and Pearl Street versus what some of the other concepts showed and how the existing YTC is laid out. I spoke about the parking lot, and then the other factor that we felt really was a benefit to this concept was that mural there. We thought we could really integrate that thoughtfully and the buildings, and then also the pedestrian flow along Washington and Pearl with the building right at the corner. There's always trade-offs, right? The nature of most things, I guess, but especially transit. The existing facility, which has had a lot of discussion about what that could be if we vacated it, would be demolished. We would not be able to use that facility. However, with being able to maximize the building area on the platform, we felt that we had more than enough area. We did want to talk about what some of those spaces internally to the new YTC could be. We have that ability, we think, with the larger footprint. This does increase the complexity of construction. I read that a little bit as maybe slightly increased price. It will require staging for how we build the new ITCs. We really haven't thought through exactly how we move the routes. We would be able to maintain Pearl Street for some of the time, we think, as we build the new facility, but they will need to have we will need to have staging during construction. And then the development potential with the mid-block option C, that development potential was really along Pearl Street for some other use. And with this, of course, we'll not be able to have that frontage along Pearl. But again, we feel that this is a known entity or a known project. This really activates Pearl Street as soon as it's built today. And we plan to build a very beautiful, functional transit center that we think will really be a huge asset to the community. So I can go back to any other ones, but just wanted to leave it now open for your thoughts. I have just a couple more slides on next steps, but would love to hear your thoughts. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'm curious about the footprint that the facility will be using, the ownership of that, and have to acquire it, long-term lease, who owns it, those kind of questions.
Yep. Oh yeah, great. So we own roughly right here, this corner, as well as this corner, where the existing YTC is. The city of Ypsi owns this whole parking lot here, including the curb here where the buses are. The commercial buildings, and this is the Harmony Collective here, Krishna, those are owned privately. We have not entered into any discussions about land acquisition. That'll come at a later date. And in fact, we need to be very careful about not doing much of that at all until we have our environmental review complete. So it will require us to work with the city of Ypsi and either do a long-term lease or purchase, most likely, one of those two to build the facility.
But it's just the city.
Just the city.
No other part. That's good.
Correct. Yeah, I don't know if maybe you remember, it used to be partly owned by ENU, but they sold it to the city. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Jesse.
I have a question about the heat island thing. I remember you mentioning that at council. Is there anything about any of this construction that would make it more of a heat island than it already is? Like it's a big parking lot.
Right. I mean, I think expanding the center, potentially, however, you're right. I mean, we will need to use concrete. I would imagine that's actually, I don't know about the heat actually with that compared to asphalt, but probably not significantly, but that's really just.
I think you could probably use some sustainable technology, green roof, things like that, add additional foliage.
Yeah, it was more like I mean, of course, but it was more like what, in general, I'm wondering what the heat island effect of a building, like the only thing that biggest to me is that there's more of the spaces operate is occupied by building as opposed to asphalt or, you know.
Right.
And I was just wondering if that had an effect on, any, were buildings worse for the heat island effect than, an asphalt parking lot?
Right. I can look into that. We do plan, we can put some trees and things in here, but we do plan to do more of that to reduce that effect and make this a nice area for people, shaded and things for people to wait. But I'll look into that for you.
Yeah, my question is, and actually, Chris just mentioned it. Has there been any consideration of a green roof that would probably substantially reduce the amount of heat?
There has not been, because we really haven't gotten to the stage yet of deciding what the facility really will look like and what it will include. So this is actually, I mean, it's roughly the footprint, but it's really just for illustration purposes. So the next stage that we're getting into now, we'll look at that sustainability question. Do we want to go after LEED certification, or there's other certifications now. So that's one of our big decisions, kind of as one of the next steps. And we will look at things like green roofs and things like that as we get into the actual schematic design.
Are there any other questions before?
Well, I know this is not something that you've looked at now, but is it known whether the parking lot is capable of supporting the weight of buses? Like, is that a possible option for, like, could we do, if we basically knocked out the curb on Adams Street, could we create a temporary big mid-block transit center?
Oh,
The existing asphalt
Yes.
for staging?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Okay. I guess probably not, but.
For temporary location, I mean, just for staging.
Yeah.
It's not a great.
There are different kinds of asphalt.
Yes.
And asphalt for parking lots is relatively thin. Buses are heavy enough. It won't be a parking lot for very long.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's something that we'll definitely get into as we move along in the process. I will mention, it reminded me, we have tried to look at, what if there's buildings that can fit here or here, or park and very high level concepts, but they, are able to fit a development here of sort of a decent size that, just very rough sketches, but so there's potential in that leftover space.
I might just tell the board, I was a big fan of opening up Pearl Street for development to the city. Gretchen and Forrest were very kind in when they're bringing this to me. I pushed them really hard on it because I didn't want to have to give up on it, but I couldn't ignore the fact that this was a much better transit center. And so I was very happy that city council kind of seemed to be that way too. And it sounds like the majority of city staff.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot with city staff, and I think they have very similar, they have visions of what Pearl Street could be. But we do have, I think, a majority consensus with city of FC planners.
We really sound like this bit.
Anything else?
next steps.
Right, thank you. Okay, so continuing to work with the FTA and our NEPA experts to complete the environmental review. They actually have been very active in June and July. I don't think anyone's seen anyone out there. So now we pretty much have this finalized site concept. If you do have any comments, if you could please send them to me in the next week or so, because if we do need to change the site down the road, that's pretty major work that we need to go back and redo from a FTA NEPA perspective, so I'd love to hear any thoughts within the next week. And then we'll move into schematic design, which is roughly around 30% of design. And planning to hold our next round of public engagements in the fall. It possibly could get pushed though into the winter to actually align with, we may have to do public engagement as part of the NEPA process anyways. So, but as we get into this stage where we talk a lot more about specifically what the facility is, planning to keep meeting with our stakeholders very frequently. Because there's just been so much interest in what the facility can be. So then we'll move into the next phase of design development and construction design, hopefully by next spring 2025. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
I'll just have one comment maybe to close. They've done great work on this project. I was kind of like Jesse, I was looking for one of the other ones. They talked into this one too. Every terminal project is, which trade-off do you want? You never get everything. A big part of how we will be successful with capital projects is about getting each one of them shovel ready. As attractive as it can be to the feds, particularly because they put most of the money in, getting them as far down the development progress as we can, and then waiting for our opportunity, like with Lono, it pays off. That's how this game works. I do want to emphasize, as they said, that they're moving, they're sort of narrowing the field as we go along. If you have any comments about the site plan, please have those ideas in the next week, not a month from now, because it becomes very expensive to go backwards in this process and try to change some of these decisions, particularly after they've sent some of them to FTA and Region 5, and then go back to Region 5 and go, oh, never mind that first thing we said we wanted to do, we changed our minds. That doesn't look good to the funding agencies because they kind of go, you changed your mind a lot?
Yeah.
Are we going to regret giving you that amount? So this is kind of, it's not a final decision, but the pathway is narrowing on us for this project in a good way, in a constructive way. But we do need to sort of say, got any final comments on the footprint? Now's the time. So within a week, please. And after that, this is not cast in stone, but
getting close.
Getting really close. In a good way, again.
Thanks, Matt. So just add on, the comment, the feedback we're looking for, really focus on the site concept, the layout, not focus on the building itself. The building, we're going to be working on that next step. How big the building, what functions will be employed, the green roof or whatever the features. But right now, where the bus lanes are, pathway, the platform, right. So those are kind of the feedback we're looking.
What about like even the rough shape of the building? Like, say, okay, we're looking at possibly creating an alley between the transit center and the existing buildings. And somewhere down the line, we were to say, we don't like that. That looks like it might be a public safety issue. Like we're creating a kind of an alley. Would that be problematic?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Yeah, feedback right now.
Sure. Okay.
The general footprint of the facility.
So
that would fall under there, I think. So yes, any sort of thoughts you have in terms of how it interacts with those buildings, or how it interacts even with the parking lot or other.
That's literally the only thing I thought. And I don't even know how I feel about it.
We don't want to exclude any other feedback, like a green roof or those ideas. You can put in the email, feedback, but we're not only considering your feedback on the footprint at this stage. And then we'll take your feedback on other components to the next stage.
Very good. Thank you, Forrest. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Next on our agenda is the business plan. And Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I will thank you all for your comments. We made several
minor changes to the business intent. Basically, it is what you saw at length last time. It's a living document, so it's not really done, but at a certain point, I do need to declare it finished so I can throw it over the fence to Nina, and she can really rely on it to create the budget. So barring any additional feedback this evening, I'm prepared to sort of say, we're good for now. This is the document we're working with. I've already got a couple edits for next year, so I'm not concerned about that. And again, living document can always pivot if we have to, but happy to see if there are any other questions this evening. Otherwise, we move forward on this and not bring it back here for the law. Just talk about budget execution.
Anyone on the board have any questions or comments with regards to the business plan for 2025?
That's my comment.
Oh, thumbs up, man. Very good, very good. All right, then we will move to that budget. That's Christina Reed.
Thank you. All right, good evening. In your packet on page 79, I have provided, sorry, it's 80 actually. I have provided a draft budget preview. Today I'm just going to give an overview of some key things that are happening. It's not necessarily I'm not going to go over exactly what's in the issue brief, just kind of highlight some key things and also mention that we're still in the developmental process as well. Trying to move this forward.
Would anyone like us to dim the light?
Maybe just the one that's in front of the screen, if that's possible. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. There we go. So our agenda tonight is just another additional budget introduction with some timeline and discussion about the board and highlights. Very quick touch on that. And then moving into a little more detail on some of the assumptions that are have been presented to you at a higher level. Mostly here in the presentation, I'm going to focus on just a few key assumptions that have a significant impact on the budget. All assumptions have an impact on the budget, but some are very much bigger in terms of percentage of the budget, and that's what I'm going to focus. I'm also going to give a brief introduction of the capital budget, not so much in numbers because they didn't really put that in the issue brief in your packet, but just sort of introducing how we're looking at the budget because we are starting the capital budget development and we'll be presenting more details on the capital budget as we move through the process through committee meetings, and next in August, we'll go over the capital budget in more detail than the operating budget since we're covering more of that in the earlier parts of the budget process. So we'll move into budget. So just want to mention, we just kind of orient you to where we are in the process. We talked about this last time. I'm not going to go back through it all. Just want to point out that we are continually reviewing the business plan that Matt put together, the alignment of that with the board's ends, and then ultimately coming to the budget process for execution of transportation and for the annual budget and executing on transportation services and project implementation. So just noting that we're still, that doesn't get lost as like it's one part of the process, it's a continual part of the process. And really important is what our priorities are in the business plan. Because as we develop the budget, we want to make sure we're always advancing these priorities that are aligned with board ends as well as significantly outlined in the business plan. So we're focused on attracting the ridership and increasing ridership. We're focused on excellence in service delivery, and we're focused on continuous improvement. So everything in the budget is aligned with these priorities. In terms of the general timeline and where we are, the business plan is developed more in the beginning stages of the budget process. We start staff development of current services budget way back in May already. We are in the middle of our process now. So we're about here, right in the middle. We're moving into August where we're going to have more budget previews with the board and committee and then a draft presentation of the budget in August. We expect that in August, you'll have seen the operating budget, the capital budget, not the recommended budget, but a draft of all of that. We will have seen it in committee on several occasions. We'll have seen it at the board level on a couple of occasions. And by the end of August or middle of August, when we share this information with the board, we're also doing our official public hearing, which is for the public. It's a state requirement. And we're not anticipating from staff perspective major changes after the August board meeting. Any changes that we have would be presented in committees throughout September before we present the recommended budget for you for approval in September. And comments are still received both from the public and the staff up until that point. But past middle of August, we wouldn't expect any major changes unless there were new developments or emergent issues that came up that we weren't aware of, or there's feedback from the board in August that we would really need to consider making a change for September. So I want to move into just some preview of the summary of the draft. Basically, these are the highlights for our budget. We are operating at full service levels. Everything that we're seeing now incorporates a full year impact of the millage services. We're not going to be recommending any fare changes to fund the services or any expenses in the budget. We have a balanced budget that we're presenting throughout the process. No change to that since the last time we saw it. And as I mentioned, we're going to start on the capital budget, and capital projects will be funded fully in fiscal 25. That's our anticipation for now. So as I mentioned last time, the budget is balanced. It's a state requirement that we present a balanced budget. Here though, I just really present this to remind the board how much of our expenses are directly tied to transportation. 80% is directly attributable to transportation. So the top two categories there, and then there's administration and utilities and insurance. Also in terms of the revenues, our revenue sources are quickly becoming very limited in terms of the number of sources funding a majority of our budget. The changes that have happened, and we'll go through that just a little in just a bit. Property tax revenues and state operating assistance combined, those two things combined comprise 85% of our revenue. So while those are good, stable sources of revenue, it's something to note that two sources of revenue are a majority of or way more than a majority of our revenue. Good news though, we still have passenger revenues and other revenues that support, just much smaller in scale. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of show a history of where we've been with our revenues and what's been happening. So in this graph, we're going back to 2017 just to show kind of where revenue levels were back in 2017. As we moved into 2020, that was the year that the pandemic impacted passenger revenues. So you're seeing a big dip there. But we also started collecting and using CARES Act or pandemic relief funds money. And that's the green bar. So you can see how significantly the pandemic relief funds improved our financial position with regard to revenues over the past few years. And as we've been talking about, in 2024, we will use all of the pandemic relief funds. And so in 2025, we will have none of those. However, with the anticipation that that was going to happen, we are seeing local property taxes, which is this blue line here, increase significantly. So the reduction in revenue from pandemic relief funds and passenger fares, the reduction in passenger fares that haven't fully recovered are offset by the increase in local property taxes. So I thought that was an interesting way to share with you what's going on in the revenue side of things. So because property tax revenues is such a large percentage of our budget, I wanted to just kind of talk quickly about how we calculate them. Property tax revenue assumptions are based on property taxable values. In terms of projections, we grow them at approximately 3%, the assessed values. We also use the millage rate. So the millage rate going from 0.7 to 2.38 mils significantly increases that as well. And then we remove uncollectible accounts and fees and things that we don't actually receive in terms of property tax revenues. And that comes out to about $36.5 million in this budget in fiscal 25. Significant increase, and this was in your packet, but it's a $16 million increase over fiscal year 2024. So just wanted to share with you kind of how we look at that and how we calculate it. The second biggest source of revenue in our budget is LBO funding, which comes from the state. That's the line haul bus operating funds generated at the state level. This is interesting. It's roughly been around 29 to 35% over the last many years. I thought this chart was interesting. The bar chart portion shows the LBO funding from the state that we've been getting over the last 12 years. The blue part is LBO funding that comes from the Comprehensive Transportation Fund, which is a fund that's a longstanding fund that the state collects money from mostly like things in the state. So gas tax and things like that. That mostly funds the CTF. So those are the funds that they've been distributed. In 2024, you may remember me talking about an influx of funds from the state that they gave to transit in order to spend. And so our percentage or the amount of funding available to transit agencies across the state went up significantly. And that is the orange part of the bar in 2024. So that was funding that was not promised beyond 2024. They told us we're going to have additional funding this year and we're giving it to transit. But beyond that, expect it might go away. What happened in the state budget this year, there was a lot of back and forth, and we identified this as a risk last month. Since then, the state, and Jeff will talk more about the process of that, but the state did approve a budget. And the budget that the state approved actually was only $15 million less than last year because they found additional funding from another source to supplement the CTF fund. So that's why they're still orange in fiscal 2025. So that's good news for us. The interesting thing about what's going on with the actual funding that we expect to receive. So urban systems, this is the percentage that this revenue generates as a percent of expenses to transit systems, to urban transit systems. So the line part is the percentage that we have received over the past 12 years. So you can see it's varied, 31% all the way, 29, 33, 31, as I mentioned, somewhere between 29 and 33 to 34%. In FY24, we got 34%, and that was based on the revenue that was generated from the CTF and the other funds. The total amount of budget in fiscal 24 at the state level was $261 billion, which is great. It generated 34%. But this year, it only went down by 15 million to $246 billion. And they lowered the percentage from 34 to 30. Now, if you look back at fiscal 23, we got 29%, which is pretty similar to the percentage we're projecting this year. But the revenue back in 23 was only 201 billion. It was $45 million less than they approved this year. So the interesting thing to me about that is I expected that our percentage would be somewhere between 29 and 34, but I expected because of the amount of funding being significantly higher than in 23, that might be closer to 32%. But the state said, no, it's going to be 29.6%. So that's what we're assuming in our budget. I don't really have a good explanation for that other than my thought that transit, we've been talking about inflation across the board. And I think that all transit agencies are experiencing that. The only reason that our percentage could be lower when revenue is going up is that expenses over the whole state are increasing at a level that keeps our percentages actually considerable to where they were before. So I believe that's what's causing that. At the end of the day, it's not really up to us to decide what we're going to get. The state tells us it's going to be 29%, and that's what we'll get. We do have a true up at the end of every year. And if, in fact, the expenditures across the state are lower or higher, it does get reconciled. So if this number appears if what we budget now, or what the state tells us that we're gonna get is incorrect, it will be updated based on actuals later. So there's not a huge amount of risk in that number, and I think they tend to be conservative to make sure that we're getting, that we don't have to pay them back a lot of money at the end of the year, which we usually don't. So not a lot of risk in that number now because the budget is approved by the state, but I thought this was really interesting, and I thought the board might be aware of how this works because of the percentage of our revenue budget that it is. So when we look at expense, we know and we have known that our expenses went up in 2024. We knew they were going to go up again in 2025 due to the expansion of services. So this is just a stack bar chart kind of illustrating how that correlates into the budget itself. You can see that a majority of the increase is in salaries, wages, and benefits, which is what you might expect. We have to hire more operators and things like that for our service. Basically, what's happening here is historically expenses were kind of trending upward a little bit every year till we get to 2020 and 2021 when the pandemic hit. We scaled back services, reduced costs, and then reinstated a lot of that service in 2022. Not all of it, 100%, but once we reinstated all service levels in 2023 and 2024, you can see those expenses shot right up due to inflation and making sure we could put services, 100% of our services back on the street as planned. But the costs went up due to inflation. So this is where we're trending now. In 2024, we went up because we started planning for the millage services. So we'll have 2 months of the millage services this year and a few extra months for a smaller percentage of the services. So that's what caused the increase in 24. So really what you're seeing from 2023 to 2025 is a 2-year growth, all based on the millage. We were able to fund a portion of that a little bit early from pandemic relief funds, as we talked about, and that's what we're seeing in the budget. So what we're seeing in the budget is exactly what we had projected would happen, coming to fruition. So if you looked at the detail that's provided in the packet, the P&L that shows the expenses, basically most of the expenses across the board are due to the increases related to millage services. So I wanted to point out here that that's broadly hitting our expenses across the board. We have additional staff that we've added between 24 and 2025. Most of that is in 25, and 25 is the first full year impact of all of that. Additionally, there's general benefits inflation. We're estimating that to be somewhere around 10 to 12% in the budget. So there's a general increase in benefits, and then there's an increase in benefits because of the increase in staff. So it's kind of twofold when it comes to that. Diesel, fuel, and gas, maintenance, supplies, and equipment, all of these things are going to go up as our service hours go up. Buses on the street longer, more frequently, costs money. Insurance, when you have buses on the street longer, you have more service hours, you have more staff, it increases your overall liability, so your insurance costs go up. There is some inflationary factor in insurance. Right now, we are fully out into the market looking at what rates we can get. We don't have those finalized. We do expect we'll have numbers by August. So there may be some adjustments to this. Generally, what we're projecting right now is about 15%, which is what we're seeing in the market for just the inflationary portion. But the other portion is related to just to increase in service hours, staff, and budget. So all in, I presented this last time, this really hasn't changed much. So the big key things that are changing in the budget are related to property tax revenues, no more pandemic relief funds, less federal operating assistance, which we expected. Revenues are still going up. Expenses are going up corresponding to the new services, and all in, we're projecting a balanced budget with a little bit of a surplus. And we're expecting, and it was demonstrated in the table in the packet, we're expecting that any surplus that we have this year will be needed to fund the operating reserve. We have to maintain 2.5 months of operating reserve, and as our budget goes up, that reserve has to go up as well. We did not have to fund any of that in fiscal 24, but in fiscal 25, with the 2-year impact of the budget growth, we're going to need probably about $1.5 million. So that's about where the surplus is going. And just like every year, you have budget opportunities and risks in the budget. I'm not gonna go through all of these, but I do wanna point out, some positive, a really big positive for us is that we have all of our reserves that are funded. We have the capital reserve, which isn't even a requirement, but it's something that we've built up over time. We have no debt. So everything that we see in our operating budget and our capital plan, none of that is funded by debt. None of that is funded by anything that would have an impact going forward or a negative impact going forward. That's really important. On the risk side, one risk we have in the budget is, are our estimates accurate for the services that we're going to put out? So we've estimated what our expenses will be based on increased service. We're still finalizing the run cut for the services. I know that service hours are coming in line with what we expected in the millage. So I'm anticipating no major impacts there, or changes there, but I just wanted to point out that that's always a risk when you've got a lot of service. In terms of inflation, that's always a risk, both on the operating side and the capital side. Our federal funding for capital is stable. However, I pointed this out last time. I wanted to keep reminding the board that we had an increase of capital funding for IIJA bill that will expire in 2026. That was a 30% increase in our formula funding. So our formula funding, which is funding that we get just for being a transit agency and operating in the service area we operate in at the levels we operate, and with passengers that we have. That formula funding is generally around $10 to $11 million a year with the IIJA funding. When that goes away, it could drop to 7 or 8 million. So that's something that we're anticipating already in our projections, and it's a risk that funding may or may not come back. So just something we're keeping in mind. Also, it's presidential election year and things can change. So we assume that the current administration would continue their plans as they devise them now if the current administration stays in place. They may or may not. So this can change regardless of who's in the White House, but there is more risk with if the presidential election changes hands in terms of political parties, because we don't know what their agenda will be yet, and we don't know how that will impact transit funding overall. So it's just something that we keep in mind in terms of general risks. So even with all the risks and opportunities I pointed out, I did want to start to introduce to you what our financial outlook looks like. So as we've right-sized 2025 in this graph is consistent with the budget I just shared with you, or the revenues and expenses we're expecting. As you can see, we're expecting a small surplus, and we expect to have a small surplus over the next couple of years that diminishes over time until at which point we are basically at the end of this millage cycle. When we set the millage rate, we set it at a rate that would allow us to maintain the services through the millage, through the 5-year projection period for the millage. And that when we got to the end of it, we would have enough money to continue operating at that level without any further increases. You can see that in 2028, the vertical line here is the last year of the current millage. That's the last year we collect money of the current millage, which means we'll have enough money to operate through 2029, where revenues and expenses are expected to essentially be flat, because that's what the millage rate was based on. Beyond that, if revenues and expenses trend like they have in the past, expenses outpace revenues in terms of growth. So without additional funding beyond that period, we could potentially end up in a deficit if the millage, depending on the next millage. So we may have to ask for a small increase just to keep operations as is, just because expense increases outpace revenues in general. That's just what it looks like right now. We have many years before we get to that point, but I just wanted to share that's why it kind of shifts over beyond that, because the millage was set to sustain us for the 5-year period. So I didn't really mention this as a risk because in 2025 and 26 and 27, we are stable with our property tax revenues, and we feel confident in that. But the risk is we only approve 5-year millages. So beyond that, if that millage doesn't get renewed, or if there's, if there's any risk there, or if, we're unable to increase the millage at some point, then we might have to be more creative about cost management. So with that in mind, we're always careful about cost management. We're good fiduciaries of our public funding, but we wanted to share, that as you look forward, there is a risk on the millage side because you have to redo it every 5 years. So just something to think about. And with that, I just want to introduce the capital budget at a very, very high level. There aren't a lot of numbers here today, just because I wanted to kind of just talk about the introduction and get you oriented to what we're going to start to see more of in the next couple of weeks and through the next month. Our capital programs, the way we look at them, are largely in terms of categories. So we look at state of good repair, which is projects that we're maintaining our current assets. So we're maintaining we're replacing buses as needed. We're upgrading our facilities to maintain the useful life of our facilities. That's a majority of what the state of good repair is buses and facilities. It's about 74 to 75% most likely. And as the numbers change, those percentages could change a little bit. Historically, this is about where it's been. Then we have value added projects, which are projects that add additional value to current assets or current things that we own. It's not a totally new project. It's just a project, something that enhances something that we already have. Then we have expansion of services, which are things like BRT and things like that. So for 2025, we don't expect the cost for expansion of services to be high because we're in the very beginning phases of some of those larger projects, like the YTC renovation expansion, because the facility is going to be greatly expanded. It's not status quo. It's not just replacing something that we have today with a similar size of facility. It's expanding the facility significantly and changing everything about the way we do that. So that's considered expansion. And then we have a little small amount that we use just for research and development, which is available with grant funding as well. So then how do we fund our capital budget? Primarily federal and state funding. That's the bottom line. Federal contributions are about 75%, state is 20%. And then we have some earmarks. And over time, we'll have another category in here, which would be potentially using our capital reserve as we need it and things like that. We'll be introducing this at a much more detailed level throughout the next month with specific projects and specific things. I just wanted to kind of get you oriented to where we're headed, what the funding sources are, and how we look at and how we categorize our capital programs as we start to move into a more detailed budgeting process with that. And with that, just kind of summarizing what I mentioned before, that our budget's balanced, no fare changes, capital program will be funded, and what our budget entails. Next steps are really continuing capital budget development, listening to feedback from the board and the public about our budget and comments related to that. Working with internal staff to finalize operating budget projections, incorporating initiatives that come out of the line of corporate business plan, as well as sharing additional information for transparency regarding the budget, including cash flows and things like that we will be providing that's required under our policy for budgeting and planning. So those are the next steps, and I'm happy to answer any questions about anything in the packet or the presentation. And there will be a couple more presentations to come. So the floor is open for the board. If there are any questions, Jesse?
Two questions. When we said the capital reserve, when you're talking about the capital reserve, later on, we would be thinking about looking into where funds might be drawn. Was that? I'm sorry, I may have zoned out, but was that talking about this budget cycle or in the future?
I don't expect we'll be asking for any fiscal 2025.
Okay.
But we expect that as we present the capital plan as like a 10-year plan,
right,
we see where we might need to use that to what we want to do with capital reserve is use it to leverage the opportunity for more funding So like using it for a mat, something like that, but we will make assumptions about that in the budget. That does not constitute approval by the board to use the capital reserve. There will be a separate request specifically related to requesting funding from the capital reserve before we actually can use it. But there will be projections in the 10-year plan for capital that will look like we're gonna kind of mark, you not use it necessarily, but plan to use it to fund our projects.
So that at this point, there are no plans to call on the capital budget for fiscal year 25.
No, the only possibility for that I see would be if we need to use capital reserve fund for a local match on any of our hybrid buses or hydrogen buses. I'm not sure. We're still evaluating if we're going to be able to get them that soon. Any of those buses, as Matt said, lead time is 2 to 3 years. So at this point, my information is I'm not expecting that we take delivery of a hybrid or hydrogen bus in the next fiscal year, which means we wouldn't need to use that funding.
Okay. The other one is on operating budget. You had the federal operating assistance. Is that something that's eventually going to go away? It's right now a very small amount. I guess I thought that federal operating assistance was going to be eventually a thing of the past.
It isn't. It isn't. So in the budget, there are 2 line items. One is federal operating assistance, and the other one is other federal programs. So the federal operating assistance line was $2.5 million in fiscal 24. So far, we haven't even had to use it. That's the line item that was trending to be about $2 to $3 million a year in the past, that we said we wanted to not use that money anymore. So we replaced it with the millage funding. So that line will not come back.
Okay.
Within the millage projection period, the 5 years that we talked about. The other federal programs are mostly, like, the reason it went from 4.4 million to 1.3 is because that's where the D2A2 funding was coming from. So that's more of a pass through and capital cost of contracting. So the two major things under other federal programs are using capital money for capital cost of contracting, which is allowed and is something we will continue because we're not using it for operating, we're using it for capital. It's just under an operating capital, if you will. It's a small amount. It's a small amount. It's probably about 600,000 of the 1.3.
I know. I saw it was like a minuscule amount, but again, it was me trying to understand like the just that it just is very confusing to me.
Yes, that's why it's 2 separate lines, so we could identify this is the portion that we essentially solved what we call an issue with using our capital money for operating. That was the federal operating assistance.
Right. So federal operating assistance is something that will probably be on future budgets as well, but not that problematic. We're taking operation money, we're taking money from capital to pay for operations.
No, the only reason there's anything here is because we're using capital money for capital, but it's called operating capital. It's just a category. But it is still capital. They're operating things that we buy that we capitalize. So it's still capital. Then there's a portion of that.
Yeah.
And then there's a portion
I think I got
that's a cash. So
yeah, no, I'm good.
Do not feel bad. If transportation funding looked like Super Mario Pipeline, it would be designed by like a crazy man. It's just pipes going in all different directions. It is a bit of a mess. It takes a lot of time just to keep it straight.
Thank you.
After 20 years, I think I almost understand.
Are there any other questions or comments from the board? Thank you so much, Lena. You're welcome. We'll move on to the advocacy agenda 7.4, and that's Mr. Jeff Piper.
For tonight's sake, but first I want to thank everyone for the feedbacks and comments we did receive on the advocacy agenda. I'm just gonna very few minor changes to go over. Starting off, we had a couple of cosmetic changes just made to the roles document, and then just replacing, I think I mislettered one of the items on the advocacy table. In addition to those, on the advocacy table, we did change the language in, under opportunity. The first thing, funding, it was initially listed as, increased local funding via millages. We changed that to maintain, or increase local funding on millages. We had a section down at the bottom related to defense. We removed that in essence, the deregulation aspect kind of encapsulates the defense, so we didn't really see a need for that. Under the tactics, we became a little bit more precise with our language, particularly relating to advocating for more bus service throughout. I think there was some vague wordage, so we made it a little bit more precise. And then the only other change on the board member roles was changing deputized agent to designated agent. Just changing up the verbiage on that. As Matt said, this, like the corporate business plan, is very much a living document. Welcome feedback continuously, but I think myself and CEO believe it's at a point where we can go ahead and get started with some things. Happy to field any immediate questions.
Excellent. Any questions from the board? Seeing none, I can really appreciate it. We're gonna move on to the CEO report, 7:35.
Sure. So, not going to repeat all the great news about some of our successes and excellent progress we've had so far. I'll note we're back in the parade business. Congratulations to the many volunteers and Jeff and Sam who organized it. I look forward to many more participations around town. We got our super bathroom up and running. The throne, you may remember this, as the world turns, the super porta-john has been installed up the block at the YTC. We look forward to running that for years. How that goes. I'd like to ask Jeff just to say a few words. Dina talked about the budget and the LTO percentage. I want to ask Jeff just to say a few words about how that cookie crumbled as we met last month. I think the state was in the last throes of it. We didn't have a final thing, and now the dust has settled enough that we can kind of look back and say, okay, here's what happened. Maybe Jeff, if you could briefly talk.
Sure. Yeah, I'll provide just very high level. I think Dina did a really nice job of showing how the LBO impacts our budget. But last time we spoke, I think I spoke about the SOAR bills, which was the supplemental funding package that was unfortunately tabled into the fall. Since then, the budget has been passed, and back in March, I believe it was, Governor Whitmer rolled out her executive budget, and that caused a lot of red flags within the transportation industry because it was a pretty substantial funding decrease. We kind of set a target goal to get to $261 million. We reached, I think, 246 million of those through negotiations and conversations that took place in the legislature. So not 100% where we wanted to be. I'm very much of the mindset it could have been a lot worse. So we should be grateful for what we were able to accomplish. And, you know, the SOAR funding conversations are going to continue with that throughout the summer and back into the fall. With the budget that was passed, no innovation grants were included in that. So overall, I think it wasn't where we wanted to be. It could have been worse though. And we'll see how SOAR plays out in the fall. I think there's an additional opportunity for additional transportation funding with that package.
And just as a follow-up on that, and then one more comment on state level, and then open for questions. That's Jeff's description to you. We have not, in the last 9 years, I know, spent a whole lot of time talking about what actually happened in Winston, what actually happened in Congress. That's information we look forward to bringing you a lot more of, because as Dina, I think, very eloquently said, that's where most of our money's coming. You know, the taxpayer thing, the millage thing is an every 5-year kind of Herculean lift, but it's these annual decisions from legislature and Congress that we want to get much more involved and engaged with and help you understand it as best we can, because it is a mess inside a confusing regurgit of legislation. So
I may add just one more additional political note. So some of the conversations and things that may have played out is the SOAR package going at the same time as the budget discussions may have taken some wins out of the sale for the actual amount going in the budget. That's just the ebb and flow of politics and the give and pull. And those are things we're gonna have to navigate and face, in this process.
It may have been a timing thing, having this big SOAR proposal for transit coming forward at the same time, there was a big budget ask for LBO. They may have actually canceled each other out a little bit, so it may have been in retrospect, poor legislative tactic, but who knows? One last thing I want to note on here, some of you are aware, I have been participating in the State Transit Association, the MPTA, for most of my time here, been on the board for some time. We have hired a new executive director, first one in about 25 years. John Dolmas will be joining the MPTA this month, week or so, as our new executive director. He'll have about a month of trans overlap with the outgoing fellow Clark, and then he will be fully in the seat. I'm really looking forward to working with John. I feel like the state association has not been as engaged or as effective as it probably could be. I think Rich and Kathleen have been there and you've seen it, and I think you saw a pretty good example. I wish they'd all been that good as the one we saw. I'm really looking forward over the next 12 months to getting to know John, working with him, and hopefully seeing a much more robust industry engagement statewide in Lansing, because I think that it's something that we've been a bit weak on. So I'm looking forward to how we can report back to you about improvements in that area that's sort of adjacent to what we do. With that, that's report. Happy to answer any questions.
Does anyone on the board have any questions or comments with regards to the CEO report? Mike?
I just have one brief question about the Blake Transit Center, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
The report where the Housing Commission has selected one of Stephen Ross's companies to basically be the real estate brains behind the development. Do you have an idea of whether that company feels favorable toward the existing design proposal?
I don't think the design proposal is optional. The nuances maybe, but I think the general idea is nailed down. But for us, what are your thoughts?
I think Grand Chan, looking at the Grand Chan.
Okay, so in their proposal, they kept the design as is. There can be changes though. It wasn't necessarily, firm that they had to do that, but their proposal was to keep the existing design. So we'll see what kind of unfolds as we get into the design with them.
Thanks.
That's only for the housing side, but for transit, we have been said all along. That's definitely an essential component for that development.
Yeah, my reason for the question is, of course, if Stephen Ross has different ideas, that could slow things down quite a bit.
It's already delayed by quite a few months.
At least.
And the saga of this particular parcel is long and convoluted. I don't think we can take it for granted that the design that has been accepted by the Housing Commission is going to be the one at the end of the day. This project has faced rising interest rates and some cost estimates that came in a while back that were enormously higher than they were expecting. So the future is uncertain and has been for this parcel for some time. We do expect at some point that we will be asked to pay our share, so don't ever forget that. But for now, everyone's telling us that nope, you're still in there. Same basic idea.
Sorry, one quick addition. The proposal for financing did change quite a bit, and I'm sure we'll learn more about that as they get into it, but you'll probably see a lot of changes with that. In terms of there's still the affordable housing component, but there may not be a market rate. So we'll see how that unfolds as we talk with Related Midwest.
Stay tuned.
Any other questions or comments about the CEO report? Seeing none, we'll move on to 8.0 emergent issues. At each of your stations, there is a walked on issue briefs in regards to the CEO employment agreement. I've been in talks with Matt, who has graciously said that he would like to enter into continued discussions of renewal of this contract. So in here, it describes the policies that guide us and direct us. Also in his employment agreement, no less than 10 months prior to the expiration date of that agreement, he needs to begin discussing the renewal of this agreement, and all of this is done through the governance committee. The reason this is here for you is it's a board decision to be able to allow the governance committee to begin negotiations, and so that is why this is in here. Is there any questions or discussion on the issue brief as it's written?
I'd like to clarify, if it's all right, that my contract doesn't actually expire, I think, until May.
Yeah, it's in the issue brief. His contract expires May 31st of 2020. Would anyone like to make a motion that we enter into discussions about renewal for the contract of the employment agreement for Matt Carpenter?
Someone correct.
Seconded by Chris. All those any discussion on the motion as it's been presented? All those in favor? Excellent. Thank you so much. That passed unanimously. We'll move on to action item recap. That's Matt and Deb.
Okay, so here's greatest hits list of tonight's epic meeting. So first of all, you did approve in the consent agenda new meeting dates for the coming fiscal year. Don't be surprised if you start seeing placeholders showing up from Deb. Rich and I are going to have some more conversations about ownership linkage tactics. Thank you for being flexible there. The environmental sustainability monitoring report was accepted. The policy is being sort of kicked over to the service committee for further consideration. And everyone's going to say, yeah, let's see how the monitoring goes in the next period and see what the data looks like in this, and we'll just sort of run with it. You approved new ends policy this evening. The safety policy became the new policy 113, which was approved. So we will need to update the policy manual and send that out again. And we'll note there are some staff vacations coming up, so that sort of paperwork may be a few weeks out. And generally, you were pretty comfortable with the YTC site. We do ask you for any comments that occur to you over the next week. Please send them before us to Gretchen. Business plan done for the time being, as is the advocacy agenda. Both are going to start moving forward, and buckle in. It's budget time, so we're going to get deep into that over the next month or so.
Very good. So that leads to topic.
Oh, and of course, the employment agreement.
So the topics for the next meeting are the draft budget, fiscal year quarterly 3 financial report for 2024, treatment of staff will be coming our way 2.2, asset protection 2.7. We will be hearing from Mr. Brooks on falls and buses. And then we still have some future things that we'll be discussing, especially talking about some training on reasonableness and what does that mean. Is there anyone online for public comment, Deb? Just one?
Well,
no,
I'm waiting to see.
Oh,
yes. Robert Pulaski, and you are unmuted.
Thank you, Deb. And thank you again to the members of the board and Madam Chair for the opportunity to speak again. Robert Pulaski, Vice Chair for the Citizens Advisory Committee and also longtime transit rider and advocate. So I'll keep my comments brief because I know everybody in that room wants to go home, and duly appreciate all the time needed to have these conversations tonight regarding policy. One of the things that really strikes me, and now with all this grant money coming in for a lot of hydrogen buses and the investment we're putting down, it seems like we're always trying to object the fact that we're not making the investment for some of our BRT routes. For example, our 104 Washtenaw Express that I've deeply enjoyed since it's been rolled out ever since. I really want to see more enhancements done on the route, mainly having more BRT stops, maybe looking at other systems like the Rapid and their Laker line and how they have their service set up, but also looking at more grant money and having bus rapid transit lanes. I think that's one conversation that has been made multiple attempts over the course of coming to these meetings in my years, but it's just never had a lot of traction because you have to go through MDOT, you have to go through the federal level to try to receive funding for that. And it's a whole different process. The same thing with US 23 when this board had discussions about it prior. And unfortunately, I just see it as kind of stalled right now. There's not really much going on. So looking at all their alternatives long term, I want to see more service enhancements on some of these routes, but also finding ways on some of these local routes to make them more efficient. Washtenaw, for example, every time I get on Route 4, it's just a madhouse. Multiple stop after stop after stop. Everybody pulling the core, which it's a very high populated route, but always trying to find ways to increase that service enhancement. Sometimes the buses are full, and that's also a bad sign. You know, in years prior, I've brought up conversations regarding fleet enhancement, looking at articulated buses, but what's the roadblock there? The Blake Transit Center, downtown Ann Arbor. You can't fit a 60-foot long bus through downtown Ann Arbor, sadly. So there's always alternatives to that, and maybe kicking out more in service on Washtenaw Express will help with that long term. TheRide is on the road to success. In the planning department, they're doing amazing work to try to look at the service and meet the demand for its riders. And with this $25 million coming in from the FDA to invest in fleet, we've got a good chance long term. I'm just trying to provide suggestions long term, and I'd be happy to provide more feedback offline to any staff that'd be interested. And my email, I'm pretty sure most of the staff has it on file, but anytime you guys want concerns or ideas brought to my attention or anything I can help in my capacity, I would love to do that long term. Again, thank you so much for your time, and hope everyone has a great weekend and enjoy the art fair. I'm going to try and enjoy it sometime this weekend. Thanks.
That closes out public comment, and we're on to adjournment. Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn? Jesse? I have Jesse Blair the second. That would be so many all those big raise your hands. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, board.